Welcome to Sheriff Files. Please like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where are you watching from tonight. Get comfortable, relax, and let's begin. We all swim there in the summer, but no one talks about what comes up after dark. I've been sheriff of Millbrook for 43 years now, and in all that time, I've learned that some things are better left unspoken. Some truths settle too heavy in your bones, and once they're there, they change the way you see everything else. The way you sleep, the way you breathe, the way you look at still water on a moonless night. Miller's Lake sits about 2 miles east of town proper, nestled in a hollow that the old-timers used to call Devil's Cradle. Don't know why they called it that, exactly. My grandfather never said, and his father before him kept his mouth shut about it too. But names like that don't come from nowhere. They grow up from the ground like weeds, rooted in something dark and true. The lake itself is unremarkable in daylight. Maybe half a mile across, fed by an underground spring that keeps the water clear and cold even in August. The bottom drops off steep about 20 feet from shore, deeper than anyone's ever measured. Kids have been swimming there since before I was born, diving off the old rope swing that hangs from the dead oak on the north bank. In summer, you can hear their laughter carry across the water, echoing off the hills that ring the hollow like cupped hands. But when the sun goes down, everything changes. It was late September when Mrs. Henley called the station. Not about the lake, not directly. She was worried about her boy Tommy. Said he'd been acting strange for weeks. Wouldn't eat, wouldn't sleep, just sat at his bedroom window staring out toward the woods. The boy was only 12, but she said his eyes had gone old somehow, like he'd seen something that aged him from the inside out. I drove out to the Henley place that afternoon, a white farmhouse that sits on the rise overlooking the lake. Tommy was in his room when I arrived, pressed against the window glass like he was trying to push through it. His mother had to call his name 3 times before he turned around. "Sheriff," he said, and his voice was thin as paper. "Do you ever see them swimming? See who's swimming, son?" He looked at me like I was simple. "The ones who don't come up for air." Mrs. Henley went pale. "Tommy, you stop that talk right now." But the boy just turned back to the window. "They've been swimming all week. Just under the surface. You can see their shapes if you know how to look." I stayed for coffee, asked some gentle questions, but Tommy wouldn't say more. Kids have active imaginations, I told myself. Lake water plays tricks with light and shadow. But driving home that evening, I found myself taking the long way around, avoiding the road that runs closest to the water. 2 days later, old Pete Morrison came to see me. Pete had been the town's unofficial fisherman for 60 years, knew that lake better than anyone. He sat in my office wringing his cap in his hands, looking like a man who'd wrestled with something and lost. "Sheriff," he said, "I got to tell you something, and I need you to listen careful." Pete had been out on the lake the night before, trying his luck with night fishing like he'd done 1,000 times. The water was still as black glass, not even a ripple from the breeze. Perfect conditions. But around midnight, he said, the fish stopped biting altogether. Not unusual in itself, but then he noticed something else. The water was moving, he said. Not on top, mind you. Underneath. Like something big was swimming in circles down there, but staying deep enough you couldn't quite see what it was. He'd watched for maybe 20 minutes, he said, and then the movement stopped. The lake went still again. Too still. Like it was holding its breath. "That's when I saw the first one," Pete whispered. "The first what?" "Aye. Big as a dinner plate, pale green like old bottle glass. Just sitting there under the water, maybe 15 feet down, looking up at me." Pete had been drinking, I figured. Old man, alone on dark water, imagination running wild. But then he told me about the others. Started seeing them one by one, Sheriff. All around my boat. Dozens of them. Just eyes watching me from down below. Not blinking. Not moving. Just waiting. He'd paddled to shore fast as he could, left his tackle box and half his gear behind. When he looked back from the bank, he said the eyes were gone. Water smooth as a mirror again. I told Pete to lay off the bottle and sent him home. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Kept thinking about Tommy Henley and his talk of swimmers who don't come up for air. About Pete's green eyes watching from the deep. The next morning brought news that made my blood run cold. Jenny Morrison, Pete's niece, had gone missing sometime in the night. Her bedroom window was found open, screen pushed out from the inside. Her footprints led from the house straight toward the lake, clear as day in the soft earth. But at the water's edge, they just stopped. We dragged that lake for 3 days. Brought in divers from the county, sonar equipment, everything we could think of. Found nothing. No body, no trace of the girl. The divers said the water was clearer than they'd ever seen, visibility perfect all the way down to where the bottom dropped into blackness. If Jenny Morrison was in that lake, they said, we would have found her. But on the third night of searching, something happened that still makes my hands shake when I think about it. I was standing on the dock we'd set up for the dive operation, checking over the sonar readings one more time. The equipment showed the lake bottom clear as day, smooth silt, a few fallen logs, nothing else. But when I looked up from the screen, the water itself told a different story. There were shapes moving down there. Dozens of them, maybe more. Not fish, too big, too purposeful in their movements. They swam in slow, deliberate circles, like they were performing some kind of underwater dance. And every now and then, one would rise closer to the surface, close enough that I could almost make out details. Almost. I called to Deputy Harris, pointed toward the water. But when he looked, everything had gone still again. Just black water reflecting stars. You're seeing things, Sheriff, he said. Been a long few days. Maybe he was right. Maybe the stress was getting to me. But that night, I drove out to the lake alone. I'd parked on the ridge where I could see the whole expanse of water spread out below me. Brought my grandfather's old binoculars, the ones he'd used for hunting. Settled in to wait. Nothing happened for the first 2 hours. The lake sat quiet and black, surrounded by the dark silhouettes of trees. A few night birds called from the woods, but otherwise the silence was complete. I was starting to think I'd imagined it all when the water began to change. It started as ripples, concentric circles spreading out from the center of the lake. But there was no wind, nothing to disturb the surface. The ripples grew stronger, more regular, like something huge was breathing down there in the depths. Then I saw the lights. Pale green phosphorescence rising from deep water, dim as dying embers but unmistakably there. They moved in patterns, spirals, figure eights, complex geometries that hurt to follow with the eyes. As I watched, the lights began to rise toward the surface, growing brighter as they climbed. That's when I saw them clearly for the first time. Eyes. Dozens of them, just like old Pete had said. Big as dinner plates, glowing with that sick green light. But these weren't just floating free in the water. They were attached to something. Something large and pale and wrong, with limbs that moved too fluidly to be human but too purposefully to be anything else. I watched them surface one by one, breaking through the water without a splash, without a sound. They floated there just below the surface, those terrible eyes turned upward toward the night sky. Toward me. And then, God help me, they began to sing. It wasn't music, not exactly. More like a vibration that you felt in your bones rather than heard with your ears. A deep, thrumming sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. It made my teeth ache, made my vision blur at the edges. But underneath that alien harmony, I could hear something else. Voices. Human voices, singing along with that underwater chorus. I pressed the binoculars closer to my eyes, focused on the shapes floating in the dark water. That's when I saw her. Jenny Morrison, pale as moonlight, floating among the others with her eyes wide open and glowing green. Her mouth was moving, adding her voice to that terrible song. She wasn't alone. I could see others now, shapes I almost recognized. A man in overalls who might have been Bill Sutter, who drowned in the lake 5 years back. A woman in a white dress who could have been Sarah Chin, missing since last spring. And more, too many more, floating just below the surface like they were sleeping. But they weren't sleeping. Their eyes were open, all of them, glowing with that same sick light. And they were all looking up at me. The singing stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound had been. It pressed against my eardrums like water, heavy and cold. I wanted to run, wanted to throw the binoculars away and drive back to town and never come near this place again. But I couldn't move. Those eyes held me frozen, dozens of them staring up from the black water. Then, slowly, they began to sink. One by one, the glowing shapes disappeared beneath the surface, descending into depths that our sonar couldn't fathom. The last to go was Jenny Morrison. Just before she vanished completely, I swear I saw her smile. The lake went dark. Still as glass, like nothing had happened at all. I sat in my truck for another hour, watching that empty water, waiting for something else to break the surface. But the lake kept its secrets. When dawn finally came, creeping gray and cold over the hills, I drove home and didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. What could I tell them? That their missing loved ones were still down there, changed into something that wasn't quite human anymore? That the lake was full of things that had once been people, swimming in the dark and singing songs that shouldn't exist? We called off the search that morning. Told Jenny's family that the lake had given up all its secrets, that their girl was gone. It was true in a way. The Jenny Morrison who had disappeared from her bedroom that night was gone. What I'd seen floating in the dark water was something else entirely. But the story doesn't end there. Stories like this never really end. Over the next few months, 3 more people went missing. Different times, different circumstances, but always the same result: footprints leading to the water's edge, then nothing. The state police got involved, brought in federal investigators. They found nothing, same as us. Eventually, they moved on to cases they could actually solve. The town learned to live with it, the way small towns always do. We don't talk about the disappearances anymore. Don't mention the lake except in passing. Parents tell their children to stay away from the water after dark, but they don't say why. Some truths are too heavy to carry. But I know the truth. I've seen it with my own eyes, heard it singing in the dark. The lake takes people, changes them, makes them part of something older and stranger than we can understand. And every night, when the moon is dark and the water is still, they rise from the depths to swim in slow circles and sing their alien songs. Tommy Henley still sits at his bedroom window, watching the lake. His mother moved his bed to the other side of the room, but he just drags it back. Says he has to keep watch. Says they're waiting for something. I think he's right. I think they're all down there, waiting in the dark water. Growing in number. Getting ready for something we can't imagine. And sometimes, on the very stillest nights, I swear I can hear them singing. That deep, thrumming song that makes your bones ache and your vision blur. A song that calls to something deep inside you, something that remembers what it was like before we walked on dry land. We all swim there in the summer. But no one talks about what comes up after dark. because some of us never really left the water at all. I'm retiring next month, turning over the badge to someone younger, someone who doesn't carry the weight of what I've seen. But before I go, I'm leaving this account in the station files. Not the official report, that one says the lake gave up no secrets, that the missing people are presumed drowned. This is the real story, the one that matters. Maybe the next sheriff will read it and understand. Maybe he'll know to keep people away from Miller's Lake when the water gets too still, when the night gets too quiet. Maybe he'll be smart enough to look the other way when the lake starts singing its ancient songs. Or maybe he'll be fool enough to investigate, like I did. Maybe he'll see those pale green eyes staring up from the depths and know that some mysteries are meant to stay unsolved. Either way, the lake will still be there. Still and dark and patient. Waiting for the next soul who gets too close to the water's edge, who listens too long to the songs that drift up from the deep. The lake remembers everything. And it's always hungry for more. End of record. Sheriff's Department, Millbrook County. File classification, restricted. It was stamped with tomorrow's date, and my own handwriting. I've been sheriff of Millbrook for 37 years now, and in all that time, I've seen plenty of things that would make a city cop reach for the bottle. Dead bodies that shouldn't have been where they were. Missing persons who turned up in places they couldn't have reached. Strange lights over the old Henley farm that the state boys never could explain. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what I found in my own filing cabinet that Tuesday morning in October. The manila folder was tucked between a domestic disturbance report from the weekend and a vandalism complaint from the hardware store. Clean, crisp, with that particular yellow tinge that our office folders get after sitting under the fluorescent lights for a while. But this one looked fresh. Too fresh. And when I pulled it out, my coffee went cold in my cup. October 16th, 2019. Homicide investigation. Case hashtag 2019-0847. Today was October 15th. My hands, these old, weathered hands that had held plenty of evidence over the decades, trembled as I opened that folder. Inside was a complete case file, typed up neat and proper on our department letterhead. Witness statements. Crime scene photos. Evidence logs. Even my own signature at the bottom of the preliminary report, in that cramped scrawl I developed after years of paperwork. The victim was listed as Rebecca Hartwell, age 34, found deceased in her home at 1247 Sycamore Street. Cause of death, blunt force trauma to the head. Time of death, approximately 11:30 p.m., October 15th. I knew Rebecca Hartwell. Everyone in Millbrook knew Rebecca. She worked at the post office, had 2 kids, and made the best apple pie for the church bake sale. She lived alone since her husband took off 3 years back, and she kept to herself mostly. Nice woman. Quiet. According to the file in my hands, she would be dead in about 12 hours. Now, I've been in law enforcement long enough to know when someone's playing games. First thing I did was check the computer system. No case hashtag 2019-0847 in the database. I called down to records, and Sarah, she's been filing our paperwork since before I was sheriff, confirmed we'd never used that case number. The last homicide we'd had was 2 years ago, and that was case hashtag 2017-0223. But the photos in that file. Lord help me, those photos looked real. Rebecca Hartwell, lying in what appeared to be her living room, blood pooled around her head like a dark halo. The angles were right, the lighting was right, even the furniture matched what I remembered from the welfare check I'd done at her house last spring when her sister couldn't reach her for a week. The report was thorough. Too thorough. It described evidence that hadn't been collected yet, witness statements that hadn't been given, forensic results that hadn't been processed. My own notes were there, written in my handwriting, describing a crime scene I had never visited. But the strangest part wasn't the impossibility of it all. The strangest part was how familiar it felt. Like I'd already lived through this investigation. Like somewhere in the back of my mind, I could remember walking through Rebecca's front door, seeing her body, calling for the coroner. The memory was there, faint but persistent, like trying to recall a dream after waking. I spent the rest of that morning driving around Millbrook, trying to make sense of what I'd found. Our town sits in a valley between two ridges of pine-covered hills, and on clear days you can see for miles in any direction. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where the biggest excitement is usually the high school football games and the annual Harvest Festival. We've got one main street, 3 churches, a diner that's been serving the same menu since the 1960s, and exactly 2,847 residents according to the last census. But that morning, Millbrook felt different. The shadows seemed darker, more substantial. The wind carried sounds that didn't quite make sense, whispers from empty houses, laughter from the abandoned textile mill on the outskirts of town. Even the dogs were quiet, watching me from behind chain-link fences with eyes that seemed to hold more intelligence than they should. I drove past Rebecca's house twice. The second time, I parked across the street and watched. It was a small craftsman-style home, painted pale blue with white trim. Her car was in the driveway, and I could see her moving around inside through the kitchen window. Alive. Healthy. Unaware that according to a file in my possession, she had less than 10 hours to live. The ethical thing would have been to knock on her door, to warn her. But what would I say? "Ma'am, I found a police report from tomorrow that says you're going to be murdered tonight." She'd think I'd lost my mind. Hell, I was starting to think I'd lost my mind. Instead, I called for a patrol to do extra checks on Sycamore Street. Told them we'd had some reports of suspicious activity in the neighborhood. It was a lie, but it was the best I could do without sounding like I'd gone completely off the deep end. The rest of the day passed slowly. I kept checking that file, hoping it would disappear or change or reveal itself to be some kind of elaborate prank. But it remained exactly as I'd found it, complete with details that grew more unsettling each time I read them. According to the report, the murder weapon was a cast iron skillet from Rebecca's own kitchen. The killer had entered through the back door, which Rebecca had apparently left unlocked. There were no signs of struggle, suggesting she knew her attacker. The file contained a list of potential suspects, including her ex-husband, a neighbor who'd had a property dispute with her, and her sister's boyfriend who had gambling debts. But what bothered me most was the timeline. The report stated that Rebecca had called the sheriff's department at 10:47 p.m. to report a disturbance in her backyard. The call log showed that I had taken the call personally, and told her I'd send someone to check it out. But according to the file, no deputy had been dispatched. The next entry showed Rebecca's body being discovered at 11:52 p.m. during a welfare check requested by a concerned neighbor. I'd taken hundreds of calls over the years, but I couldn't remember ever speaking to Rebecca Hartwell. Not once. Our interactions had been limited to polite nods at the grocery store, and her occasional visits to the station to renew her concealed carry permit. As the afternoon wore on, the file seemed to weigh heavier in my desk drawer. I found myself checking it every few minutes, like it might have changed or disappeared. Each time, it was exactly the same. Even my signature looked fresh, as if I'd signed it that morning instead of on a date that hadn't arrived yet. Around 5 o'clock, I decided to drive by Rebecca's house again. The patrol car I'd requested was parked at the end of the street, and I could see Deputy Martinez sitting inside, probably reading a paperback novel to pass the time. Everything looked normal. Peaceful, even. But as I sat there, watching the afternoon light fade into evening, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The crime scene photos in the file showed Rebecca's living room exactly as it appeared through her front window. Same furniture arrangement, same lamp on the end table, same family photos on the mantelpiece. But there was one detail in the photos that I hadn't paid attention to before. The clock on her wall showed 11:31 p.m. I pulled out the file and checked the time of death again. Approximately 11:30 p.m. The killer had taken a photograph of that clock, or someone had, just moments after Rebecca died. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across Sycamore Street. I watched Rebecca move around inside her house, turning on lights as darkness fell. She had no idea that someone was documenting her last hours, creating a record of events that hadn't happened yet. At 7:30 p.m., I went home for dinner. My wife, Martha, had pot roast waiting, and we ate in our usual comfortable silence. She asked about my day, and I told her it had been quiet. Another lie. The file was in my briefcase, and I could feel its presence like a weight on my conscience. After dinner, I found myself unable to concentrate on anything. The TV droned in the background while I sat in my recliner, but my mind kept returning to that impossible file. At 9:30, I called the station to check on the patrol at Sycamore Street. Deputy Martinez reported all quiet. No unusual activity. By 10 p.m., I couldn't stand it anymore. I got dressed and drove back to Rebecca's neighborhood. The patrol car was still there, and I could see the deputy's silhouette inside. Rebecca's house was lit up, and through the windows I could see her washing dishes in the kitchen. I parked 3 houses down and waited. At 10:47 p.m., my radio crackled to life. "Sheriff, we've got a call from 1247 Sycamore Street. Caller reports a disturbance in her backyard." My mouth went dry. This was it. The call from the file, happening exactly as documented. "Sheriff? You there?" I keyed the mic with shaking hands. "I'm here. I'll take it." "Copy that. Caller's name is Rebecca Hartwell. She says someone's been walking around her backyard for the last few minutes." I looked at Rebecca's house. All the lights were on, and I could see her pacing in the living room with what appeared to be a cordless phone pressed to her ear. "Tell her I'll send someone right over," I said. But I didn't move. I sat in my patrol car, watching Rebecca's house, knowing that according to the file in my briefcase, no deputy would be dispatched. The weight of that knowledge pressed down on me like a physical thing. I could have called for Martinez to check it out. I could have walked up to the house myself. But something held me back, some terrible certainty that events were unfolding exactly as they were meant to, and any interference on my part would only make things worse. At 11:15 p.m., the lights in Rebecca's house went out, one by one. First the kitchen, then the living room, then what I assumed was her bedroom. The house settled into darkness. At 11:31 p.m. I heard it. A scream. Sharp and short, cut off abruptly. Then silence. I sat in my car for another 20 minutes, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. Finally, at 11:52 p.m., I forced myself to get out and walk to Rebecca's front door. I knocked. No answer. I tried the doorknob. Locked. I walked around to the back of the house. The back door was standing open, exactly as described in the file. I called her name. No response. I drew my weapon and stepped inside. Rebecca Hartwell was lying in her living room, a cast-iron skillet beside her body. Blood pooled around her head like a dark halo. The clock on the wall read 11:54 p.m. Everything was exactly as shown in the crime scene photos. The furniture, the lighting, even the angle of her body. I'd seen it all before, in a file that documented a crime that hadn't happened yet. But as I stood there, looking down at Rebecca's body, I realized something that made my hands shake worse than they ever had in 37 years of law enforcement. I remembered being here before. Not just the photos, but the actual scene. I remembered the smell of blood and fear, the way the shadows fell across the room, the sound my boots made on the hardwood floor. I remembered calling for the coroner, securing the scene, interviewing neighbors who claimed they hadn't seen anything unusual. I remembered all of it, as if it had already happened. As if I was living the same night twice. The investigation that followed proceeded exactly as outlined in the file. Every witness statement, every piece of evidence, every lead and dead end, all of it matched perfectly. Rebecca's ex-husband had a solid alibi. The neighbor with the property dispute had been out of town. The sister's boyfriend with the gambling debts had never even met Rebecca. The case went cold after 6 months, just as the file had predicted. But here's the thing that still keeps me awake at night, even now, 3 years later. 2 weeks after I found that first file, another one appeared in my cabinet. Different case, different victim, but the same impossible date stamp. Tomorrow's date, in my own handwriting. Then another. And another. I've got 17 files now, locked in a safe in my basement. 17 cases that haven't happened yet, all documented in perfect detail. 17 futures that seem as fixed and unchangeable as the past. I've tried to prevent them. God knows I've tried. But every time I interfere, every time I try to change what's written in those files, events just adjust themselves around my actions. Different paths, same destinations. It's like trying to stop a river by putting your hand in the water. The files keep coming, and I keep investigating crimes that haven't happened yet. The people of Millbrook think I'm getting better at my job, solving cases faster than ever before. They don't know that I'm just reading from a script written by someone, or something, that can see further down the timeline than the rest of us. Sometimes I wonder if this is what fate really looks like. Not some grand cosmic plan, but just a filing system that operates outside the normal flow of time. A bureaucracy of destiny, complete with case numbers and evidence logs and signatures that appear before the pen ever touches the paper. And sometimes, late at night when the wind rattles the windows of my old house, I wonder what kind of file might be waiting for me in that cabinet. What case number will be assigned to my own death? And will I have the courage to read it when the time comes? But that's a story for another day. Maybe tomorrow. Or maybe yesterday. In a place like Millbrook, time doesn't always move in the direction you'd expect. End of file. We dug up something we weren't meant to hear. And now it won't stop. I've been sheriff of this county for 37 years, and I've seen things that would make most folks pack up and move to the city. But nothing prepared me for what we found that autumn morning in '97, buried 3 feet down in what used to be the Meridian family's back pasture. The call came in on a Tuesday. Old Pete Crenshaw had been metal detecting again, looking for Civil War relics like he'd done every weekend since his wife passed. This time, though, his detector had picked up something different. Not the usual bottle caps or rusted horseshoes, but something wrapped in oilcloth, preserved against the elements for God knows how long. Pete brought it to me personally, his weathered hands shaking as he set the bundle on my desk. Inside was a cassette tape, the kind they used to record sermons at the Methodist Church back in the 70s. The plastic case was cracked but intact, and someone had written on the label in faded blue ink, October 13th, 1973 last recording. Now, I knew the Meridian place had a history. 3 generations of that family had worked that land, and 3 generations had met ends that folks around here prefer not to discuss over Sunday dinner. The last of them, Thomas Meridian, had disappeared in the fall of '73, leaving behind a wife who moved away within the month and a property that nobody wanted to buy, no matter how low the price dropped. I should have left that tape alone. Should have filed it away with the other cold cases that gathered dust in the basement of our little station house. But something about it called to me, the way a sore tooth calls to your tongue. The first time I played it, I was alone in my office. The autumn sun was slanting through the blinds, casting long shadows across the floor, and I remember thinking how quiet everything seemed. Too quiet, like the whole town was holding its breath. The tape crackled to life with the sound you'd expect from old equipment, static and hiss and the mechanical whir of the recording mechanism. Then came a voice I recognized, though it took me a moment to place it. Thomas Meridian, sounding younger than I remembered him, though there was something in his tone that made my skin crawl. "Day 14, he said, and I could hear him moving around, rustling papers or clothing. "The sounds are getting louder. Started 3 nights ago, just after sunset. Martha says she can't hear them, but I know she's lying. I can see it in her eyes." There was a pause, filled with that electronic whisper of empty tape, and then he continued. "It's not like any animal I know. Deeper than a wolf, higher than a wildcat. It goes on for minutes at a time, sometimes hours. Last night it didn't stop until dawn." I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking under my weight. Outside, the elm trees that lined Main Street were starting to turn, their leaves the color of old blood against the gray October sky. I'd been a young deputy back in '73, barely 25 and still learning the ropes from Sheriff Hackett. I remembered the Meridian case, remembered how we'd searched that property for weeks without finding so much as a footprint. The tape continued, Thomas's voice growing more strained with each entry. "Day 15, day 16, day 17. He spoke of sleepless nights and his wife's increasingly erratic behavior. How she'd started leaving food out on the back porch, as if feeding something. How she'd taken to walking the property line at midnight, calling out to the darkness in a language that sounded like no words at all. Day 21. His voice whispered through the static. "I found the bones today. Old bones buried shallow near the creek. They're not human, but they're not animal either. Too big for a dog, wrong shape for cattle. Martha says they've always been there, says her grandmother told her stories about the old days, before the town was settled proper." I stopped the tape and sat in silence for a long moment. The shadows in my office had grown longer, and I realized the sun was setting. When had that happened? I glanced at my watch and saw that nearly 2 hours had passed, though it felt like minutes. That night, I took the tape home with me. My wife was visiting her sister downstate, so I had the house to myself. I poured 3 fingers of bourbon and sat in my recliner, the tape player on the table beside me, its red recording light glowing like an ember in the dark. Day 25. Thomas continued, his voice now barely above a whisper. "The howling came from inside the house last night. Martha was standing at the foot of our bed, but her mouth wasn't moving. The sound was coming from somewhere deeper, somewhere else entirely." I paused the tape and walked to my kitchen window. My property backs up to the old Meridian place, separated by a thin line of pine trees that have grown wild over the years. I'd lived in this house for 15 years and had never paid much attention to that stretch of land, but now I found myself staring into the darkness between the trees, looking for shapes that shouldn't be there. The bourbon was making me drowsy, so I decided to finish the tape in the morning. But sleep didn't come easy that night. Every sound, the house settling, the wind in the eaves, the distant howl of train whistles, seemed amplified, significant. I kept thinking about those bones Thomas had found, wondering if they were still out there, still buried in the soft earth near the creek. The next morning, I drove out to the Meridian place. The current owners, a young couple from the city who'd bought it sight unseen at auction, were happy to let me walk the property. They'd been having trouble with their well, they told me, and their dog had run off twice in the past month. Little things, they said, but it was starting to add up. I found the creek easily enough, a thin trickle of water that meandered through a grove of oak trees. The ground was soft there, black soil that stuck to my boots as I walked. I didn't find any bones, but I did find something else, a depression in the earth, roughly circular, about 3 feet across. It looked like something had been buried there recently, though the grass had already started to grow back. That afternoon, I called the county coroner and asked him to take a look at the Meridian autopsy files from '73. He called me back an hour later with news that made my blood run cold. There had been no autopsy. Thomas Meridian had never been found. The case had been closed as a missing person, presumed dead. So whose voice was I hearing on that tape? I locked the cassette in my desk drawer and tried to put it out of my mind. But over the next few days, I started noticing things. The town seemed quieter than usual, as if people were unconsciously speaking in whispers. Dogs on their evening walks would stop and whine when they passed the sheriff's station. And at night, when I lay in bed trying to sleep, I could swear I heard something in the distance. A low, mournful sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. By Friday, I couldn't stand it anymore. I took the tape player home again and settled in to hear the rest of Thomas's recordings. His voice had changed by day 30, becoming hollow and distant, like he was speaking from the bottom of a well. "The bones are moving," he said, and I could hear him breathing heavily, as if he'd been running. "I went back to the creek this morning and they were gone. All of them. But there's a trail now, leading toward the house. Small depressions in the ground, like footprints, but wrong. Too many toes, or not enough." The tape hissed and popped, and for a moment I thought it had ended. Then Thomas spoke again, his voice so quiet I had to strain to hear it. "Martha's gone. I woke up and she wasn't in bed. Found her shoes by the back door, but no sign of her. The howling stopped 3 days ago, right after she disappeared. I think it got what it wanted." Another long pause, filled with the sound of Thomas moving around, opening and closing drawers, the scrape of furniture being moved. "I'm going to bury this tape. If someone finds it, if you're listening to this, don't go looking for her. Don't go looking for any of us. Some things are meant to stay buried." The recording ended there, leaving only the mechanical hum of the tape player and the sound of my own breathing. I sat in the darkness of my living room, the bourbon forgotten on the table beside me, and tried to make sense of what I'd heard. The next morning, I drove back to the Meridian place with a shovel and a metal detector borrowed from Pete Crenshaw. The young couple wasn't home, which suited me fine. I didn't want to explain what I was doing or why. I found the spot near the creek where I'd seen the depression in the earth. The metal detector began clicking frantically before I'd even turned it on properly. I dug carefully, methodically, the way we'd been taught at the State Police Academy. 3 feet down, my shovel struck something hard. It was a wooden box, about the size of a shoebox, wrapped in the same oilcloth as the tape. Inside were more recordings, dozens of them, dating back to 1954. The earliest ones were on wire recordings, the kind they used before tape became common. All of them were labeled with dates and the words, "Last recording." I took them back to my office and started listening chronologically. The voices changed with each decade, first a man named Jeremiah Meridian, then his son Robert, then Robert's son Thomas. 3 generations of the same family, all recording the same impossible sounds, all describing the same terrible progression of events. The howling that started small and grew stronger. The bones that appeared and disappeared. The family members who vanished without a trace, leaving only their voices behind to warn whoever might come next. As I listened, a pattern began to emerge. The recordings always ended the same way, with the sound I had come to know too well. A low, mournful howl that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself, lasting for nearly a minute before fading into silence. And after each howl, the voice would whisper the same words. "It's satisfied. For now." But the most disturbing thing wasn't what was on the tapes. It was what I began to notice as I sat there in my office, listening to decades of fear and desperation. The howling wasn't just on the recordings. It was coming from outside, drifting through the windows of the sheriff's station, carried on the autumn wind. I looked at my calendar and felt my blood turn to ice water. It was October 13th, 24 years to the day since Thomas Meridian had made his last recording. That night, I took all the tapes home and laid them out on my kitchen table. 50 years of recordings, 3 generations of a family trapped in a cycle they couldn't break. And now, somehow, I was part of it. I called my wife and told her to stay at her sister's place for a few more days. Told her I had some police business to take care of, which wasn't entirely a lie. Then I loaded my service revolver and sat down to wait. The howling started just after midnight. Low and distant at first, like a train whistle heard from far away. But it grew closer, stronger, until it seemed to be coming from right outside my windows. I looked out through the blinds and saw nothing but darkness and the silhouettes of the pine trees swaying in the wind. The sound went on for hours, rising and falling like a tide. Sometimes it seemed almost musical, like a song in a language I didn't recognize. Other times it was pure anguish, the sound of something lost and longing and impossibly old. At dawn, it stopped. I went outside and found them, the same small depressions in the earth that Thomas had described, leading from the tree line to my back door. But whatever had made them was gone, leaving only the memory of that terrible sound and the knowledge that it would be back. That was 3 weeks ago. I've made my own recording now, speaking into the same tape player that Thomas used 24 years ago. Tomorrow, I'll bury it in the same place where Pete found the first one, along with all the others. Maybe someone will find them someday. Maybe they'll be smart enough to leave them buried. The howling has started again tonight, closer than ever before. I can see shapes moving between the trees, though I can't quite make out what they are. My dog ran off yesterday, and I haven't seen any of the neighborhood cats in days. Even the insects seem to have gone quiet. I know what's coming. I've heard it in 3 generations of voices, all describing the same inevitable end. The Meridian family thought they could break the cycle by leaving, but they were wrong. It's not about the land, or the house, or even the family name. It's about the listening. And I've been listening for too long. The howling is getting louder now, and I can see something moving in the darkness beyond my porch light. Something that shouldn't exist, but does. Something that's been waiting patiently for 24 years for someone else to hear its call. I'm going to stop recording now. Going to wrap this tape in oilcloth like all the others and bury it deep in the earth where no one should ever find it. But I know someone will. Someone always does. And when they do, when they play these recordings and hear these voices speaking across the decades, they'll become part of the cycle too. They'll start to listen for the howling in the night, start to see shapes moving in the darkness, start to understand that some things are older than the towns we build and stronger than the laws we make. They'll learn what I learned, what Thomas learned, what his father and grandfather learned before him. We dug up something we weren't meant to hear. And now it won't stop. The tape is ending now, the mechanical click of the recording mechanism growing fainter. Outside, the howling has stopped, and I know why. It's found what it was looking for. It's found me. If you're listening to this, if you've found these recordings buried in the earth where they should have stayed, then you need to know something important. You need to know that the cycle doesn't end with the last voice on the last tape. It ends with yours. Can you hear it starting? That low, mournful sound drifting through your windows, carried on the night wind? Listen carefully. Listen close. It's calling your name now. This recording was found buried in the backyard of former Sheriff Harold Wickham on November 15, 2024. Sheriff Wickham was reported missing on October 14, 1997. His body has never been found. The Meridian property and all surrounding land has been purchased by the county and designated as a nature preserve. Public access is restricted. These recordings have been archived in the basement of the county courthouse. They are not to be played outside of official police business. But if you're reading this, then you already know it's too late for warnings. The howling has already begun. I drove down East Willow Road last night. Problem is, it doesn't exist this morning. Now, I've been sheriff of Millbrook for 37 years, and in that time I've seen plenty that would make city folk question my sanity. But this thing with the roads, with whole damn streets just disappearing, this one's got me rattled in ways I can't quite explain. Even now, sitting in my office with the morning sun streaming through these dusty Venetian blinds, I can still feel the gravel under my tires from last night. Can still smell that peculiar sweetness in the air, like honeysuckle blooming out of season. But according to every map in this building, according to the town records dating back to 1887, according to everyone I've asked this morning, East Willow Road never existed. Let me start from the beginning, though that's harder than it sounds when the beginning keeps shifting on you like quicksand. It was a Tuesday. Late October, the kind of day when the light seems wrong somehow, too yellow, too thick. I'd been sheriff long enough to recognize the signs when Millbrook got restless. Towns are living things, you see. They breathe and shift and remember, and sometimes they remember things that maybe never happened at all. The call came in around 3 in the afternoon. Dispatch said Mrs. Henderson was reporting strange noises coming from the Ashford place on Pine Street. Nothing unusual there. The Ashford house had been empty for 6 months since old Jim passed, and empty houses in Millbrook had a way of attracting activity. Could have been kids. Could have been raccoons. Could have been something else entirely. I drove over in the patrol car, taking the usual route down Main, left on Maple, right on Pine. The Ashford house sat at the end of Pine Street like a rotten tooth, its windows dark and that particular shade of gray that only comes from abandonment. Mrs. Henderson was waiting on her porch across the street, arms crossed, lips pursed in that way that suggested she'd seen something she couldn't quite name. "Sheriff," she called out as I climbed from the car. "It's been going on for 2 hours now. Sounds like furniture being dragged around. But slow like. Deliberate." I nodded, checked my service weapon out of habit, and approached the house. The front door was locked, deadbolt turned, windows secure. But there was something in the air around that place, something that made the hair on my arms stand up. It smelled like dust and old paper, and underneath it all, something organic. Something that had been growing in the dark. I circled the house twice, checked every window, every door. Nothing. No signs of entry, no disturbance. But as I stood there in the backyard, looking up at the second-story windows, I could swear I heard it too. A soft scraping sound, rhythmic and patient, like someone rearranging a room they'd arranged 1,000 times before. By the time I finished my inspection, Mrs. Henderson had gone inside. The sun was getting low, painting everything in that sickly amber light that October afternoons in Millbrook were famous for. I got back in the patrol car and started the engine, but instead of heading back to the station, I found myself driving deeper into the residential streets. That's when I first saw East Willow Road. It branched off from Elm Street, right where the old Garrett property used to be before it burned down in '89. A narrow asphalt road that curved gently to the left, disappearing behind a stand of oak trees that looked older than the town itself. There was even a street sign, green metal with white letters, slightly faded but perfectly legible, East Willow RD. I'd lived in Millbrook my entire life. Walked these streets as a boy, patrolled them as a deputy, commanded them as sheriff. I knew every road, every alley, every footpath. But I'd never seen East Willow Road before. Curiosity got the better of me. I turned the patrol car down the narrow street, gravel crunching under the tires despite the asphalt surface. The trees closed in on both sides, their branches forming a canopy so thick it felt like driving through a tunnel. My headlights. When had I turned on my headlights? Caught glimpses of houses set back from the road. Small places, tidy, with yellow lights glowing in their windows. The first house had a mailbox that read, Morrison. I knew every Morrison in Millbrook, and none of them lived on a street I'd never heard of. The second house had children's toys scattered across a small front yard, a red tricycle, a deflated soccer ball, a doll with yarn hair spread in the brown grass. The toys looked old, sun-faded, but not abandoned. Used. I drove slowly, taking in details my mind struggled to process. There were people in those houses. I could see silhouettes moving behind curtained windows, could smell wood smoke from chimneys, could hear the distant sound of a television playing a laugh track from a show I couldn't identify. Normal suburban sounds, normal suburban sights, on a street that hadn't existed an hour ago. The road curved again, and I found myself in a small cul-de-sac. 5 houses arranged in a neat circle around a small island of grass with a single street lamp. The lamp was old-fashioned, wrought iron with a glass globe that cast everything in a warm, butter-colored light. Peaceful. Almost inviting. But something was wrong with the light. It didn't behave the way light should. Shadows fell at impossible angles, and when I looked directly at the lamp, it seemed to flicker with an inner darkness, as if the bulb was somehow burning black instead of bright. I sat in the patrol car for maybe 10 minutes, engine idling, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The houses all looked occupied, but I hadn't seen a single person. No one walking a dog, no one checking the mail, no one peering out from behind those glowing curtains to see why a police car was sitting in their quiet street. That's when I noticed the smell again. Honeysuckle, thick and cloying, but underneath it something else. Something that reminded me of the basement of the old courthouse, where they used to store files dating back to the town's founding. Mold and paper and time itself, all mixed together. I put the car in reverse and backed out slowly, keeping my eyes on those houses until the trees swallowed them up again. When I reached Elm Street, I looked in my rearview mirror and saw nothing but empty space where East Willow Road had been. But I could still smell the honeysuckle. I went home that night with a knot in my stomach and questions I couldn't answer. Sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the current city map spread out in front of me. Elm Street ended at the Garrett property, just like it always had. No branch, no continuation, no East Willow Road. Sleep didn't come easy. When it finally did, I dreamed of houses with glowing windows and children's toys left in yards where no children played. I dreamed of that street lamp with its wrong-colored light, and in my dream, I could see what was standing underneath it. I woke up at 4 a.m., cold sweat on my skin, but the dream slipped away like smoke before I could hold on to it. The next morning, I did what any reasonable lawman would do. I started asking questions. East Willow Road? Deputy Martinez shook his head. Never heard of it, Sheriff. You feeling okay? You look tired. I tried the town clerk, a woman who'd been filing papers and updating records for 23 years. She pulled out maps going back to the 1960s, ran her finger along every street, checked every index. Nothing. Are you sure you didn't mean West Willow? She asked. That's up by the Miller farm. I knew West Willow. This was something else entirely. I spent the afternoon driving through the residential area, retracing my route from the day before. Elm Street, left at the Garrett property, and nothing. Just empty space where a road had been. But the trees were still there, those ancient oaks, and if I looked close enough, I could see tire tracks in the dirt where something had turned off the main road recently. 3 days passed. I found myself driving by that spot regularly, sometimes during my patrol, sometimes after hours. The tire tracks faded. The trees grew together, branches intertwining until even the suggestion of a gap disappeared. But I knew what I'd seen. And more than that, I knew Millbrook well enough to recognize the signs. The town was changing, had always been changing, in ways that most folks weren't equipped to notice. Streets appeared and disappeared. Houses stood empty for decades, then suddenly had families living in them who claimed they'd been there for years. Children played in parks that hadn't existed the week before, and their parents would swear those parks had been there since their own childhoods. Most people adapted without thinking about it. The mind has a remarkable ability to adjust, to accept, to forget the impossible and remember the mundane. But some of us, maybe because of our jobs or maybe because of something broken in our heads, we noticed. We remembered. And we carried the weight of those memories like stones in our pockets. The 2nd Street disappeared on a Thursday night in November. I was working late, catching up on paperwork, when I got a call about a domestic disturbance on Cherry Lane. Simple enough. Cherry Lane was a short residential street that ran parallel to Main, mostly young families and retirees. I'd responded to calls there plenty of times over the years. But when I got to where Cherry Lane should have been, I found nothing but an empty lot overgrown with weeds and surrounded by a chain-link fence. The houses that had stood there that morning, the Kowalski place with its neat flower garden, the rental property where the college students lived, the small ranch house where the Thompsons had raised 4 kids, all of it was gone. And nobody remembered. I called dispatch. About that domestic disturbance on Cherry Lane. What domestic disturbance, Sheriff? I don't have any record of a call. I checked my notebook. There it was, written in my own handwriting. 11:47 p.m. domestic disturbance, Cherry Lane, possible 10 to 54. But according to every official record, according to the town map, according to everyone I asked, Cherry Lane had never existed. The empty lot had been there for years, maybe decades. Part of some abandoned development project from the 1970s that never got off the ground. I stood at the edge of that lot at midnight, looking out over the brown grass and the scattered debris, and I could swear I heard voices. Faint, like they were coming from very far away, but distinct enough that I could almost make out words. A man's voice, raised in anger. A woman's voice, pleading. A child crying. The sounds of a domestic disturbance that had never happened on a street that had never existed. That's when I started keeping the journal. I wrote down everything I could remember about East Willow Road and Cherry Lane. Every detail, every smell, every sound. I drew crude maps, documented the locations, recorded the dates and times. If the town was going to erase these places, at least I'd have some record of them. By Christmas, I'd documented 7 vanished streets. Hickory Avenue, which had run behind the elementary school and housed 3 families with young children. Gone overnight, replaced by a small park that everyone swore had been there since the town was founded. Riverside Drive, a winding road that followed the creek for about half a mile before connecting back to Route 7, vanished on a Sunday morning, leaving only empty space and the sound of running water where no water ran. Prospect Street, a steep hill lined with Victorian houses that had somehow maintained their 19th century charm, disappeared during a blizzard in January, and when the snow melted, there was only a grassy slope where the road had climbed. Each time, it was the same. The street would be there one day and gone the next, with no trace it had ever existed except for my memories and my increasingly detailed journal. The townspeople adapted, their minds filling in the gaps, creating new histories to explain the empty spaces. But I remembered. And with each disappearance, I could feel something watching me. Something that knew I was keeping track, that knew I hadn't forgotten. The journal started coming with me everywhere. At night, I'd lock it in the safe at the sheriff's office. During the day, it rode in my patrol car. I documented everything: the layout of the vanished streets, the names on the mailboxes, the colors of the houses, the faces I'd glimpsed in windows. I made sketches of street signs and fire hydrants, and the particular way shadows fell across empty driveways. And slowly, a pattern began to emerge. The streets that disappeared all had something in common. They were quiet places, peaceful places, where ordinary people lived ordinary lives. But if you looked close enough, if you paid attention to the details, there were always signs that something was slightly off. Lights that burned with the wrong color. Sounds that came from empty houses. Children's voices where no children lived. It was like the town was shedding parts of itself, discarding the pieces that didn't quite fit, keeping only what felt real enough to sustain. But real according to what? And who was deciding what belonged and what didn't? The answer came to me on a warm night in late March. I was driving my usual patrol route, checking on the empty lots where streets used to be, when I saw movement in the one where Cherry Lane had stood. A figure walking through the tall grass, moving with purpose but no urgency. I cut the headlights and coasted to a stop, watching. It was a woman, middle-aged, wearing a pale dress that seemed to glow in the darkness. She walked to a specific spot in the lot and stopped, her head tilted as if she were listening to something. Then she raised her hand and waved, a gentle gesture of greeting or goodbye. I got out of the car as quietly as I could and approached the fence. The woman didn't seem to notice me. She stood in the empty lot, waving at something I couldn't see, and I realized she was standing exactly where the Kowalski house had been, where Mrs. Kowalski used to tend her flower garden. "Ma'am?" I called softly. She turned toward me, and in the dim light from the street lamp, I could see her face clearly. It was Mrs. Kowalski, but wrong somehow. Too pale, too still, like a photograph that had been left in the sun too long. "Sheriff," she said, and her voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. "I can't find my house." "Mrs. Kowalski," I said carefully, "when did you last see your house?" "This morning. I went to water my roses, but—" She looked around the empty lot with confusion. "The roses are gone too." I opened my mouth to respond, but she was already fading, becoming transparent against the darkness. Within seconds she was gone, leaving only the smell of roses and fertilizer hanging in the still air. That's when I understood. The streets weren't just disappearing. The people who had lived on them were disappearing too, but they didn't know it. They wandered through empty lots, looking for houses that no longer existed, living lives that had been erased from reality but not from their own memories. Millbrook wasn't just a town. It was something alive, something that fed on the lives and memories of its residents. And when those lives became too complicated, too real, too human, it simply edited them out. Deleted them like words on a page, leaving only blank space where they used to be. But the editing wasn't perfect. Sometimes things leaked through. Sounds from vanished houses. Smells from gardens that had been erased. People who didn't realize they no longer existed. And sometimes, for reasons I couldn't fathom, witnesses like me who remembered what had been lost. I went home that night and added Mrs. Kowalski's encounter to my journal. The book had grown thick with observations, drawings, theories. It was the only proof I had that any of this was real, the only evidence that entire streets full of people hadn't just vanished from existence. But as I wrote, I began to notice something troubling. Some of the earlier entries, the ones about East Willow Road and the first few vanished streets, were becoming harder to read. The ink seemed faded, the words less distinct. And when I tried to remember specific details about those early disappearances, they felt fuzzy, uncertain. The town wasn't just erasing the streets. It was erasing my memories of them. I started making copies of everything, keeping multiple journals in different locations. But it didn't matter. Whatever force was at work in Millbrook was stronger than paper and ink. It was rewriting reality itself, and my journals were part of that reality. By June, I'd lost 3 more streets and most of my documentation about the early disappearances. The town was cleaning house, and I was the only witness left who even suspected what was happening. That's when I made my decision. If Millbrook was going to erase these people, these places, these lives, then someone needed to remember them. Someone needed to keep their stories alive, even if those stories were slowly being edited out of existence. So I started talking. To anyone who would listen, I told them about the vanished streets. Most people thought I was losing my mind, suffering from stress or early dementia. But a few listened with the kind of attention that suggested they noticed things too, felt the town shifting around them, experienced that moment of confusion when they went looking for a place that no longer existed. And now I'm telling you. Because last night, I drove down East Willow Road again. It had reappeared, exactly as I remembered it, with the same houses and the same wrong-colored light from that strange street lamp. But this time, when I reached the cul-de-sac, there was someone waiting for me. A man in a sheriff's uniform, standing under the lamp with his hands clasped behind his back. He was older than me, his hair white and his face lined with years of experience. But I recognized him immediately. It was me, or a version of me, or what I might become. "Sheriff," he said as I got out of the patrol car. "Sheriff," I replied. "You've been keeping track," he said. It wasn't a question. "Someone has to." He nodded slowly. "The town doesn't like being watched. Doesn't like being remembered. I figured that out. You know what happens next." I did know. I'd known for months, maybe longer. The pattern was clear. The town erased what didn't fit, what paid too much attention, what remembered too much. I'd been documenting the disappearances, but I'd also been making myself a candidate for disappearance. "Will anyone remember?" I asked. The other sheriff smiled sadly. "Someone always remembers. That's how it works. The town needs a witness, needs someone to know what it's doing, even if that someone eventually becomes part of what gets erased. And then someone else starts noticing. Someone else starts keeping track. The cycle continues." I looked around the cul-de-sac, at the houses with their glowing windows and their impossible shadows. "Are they real? The people in these houses?" "Real enough. They're the ones who fit, who belong, who don't ask too many questions. They're what the town keeps. And us? We're what it discards. But not completely. Never completely." I understood then. East Willow Road wasn't just a street that appeared and disappeared. It was a place between places, a repository for the town's discarded memories. The sheriff standing in front of me had once been in my position, documenting the disappearances, trying to make sense of the impossible. And eventually, he'd become part of what needed to be remembered. "How long do I have?" I asked. Does it matter? It didn't really. I'd already made my choice when I started keeping the journal, when I decided to remember the forgotten streets and the people who'd lived on them. Some things are more important than self-preservation. Will you remember me? I asked. For a while, he said. Until my replacement starts asking questions. I nodded and got back in the patrol car. When I looked in the rearview mirror, the other sheriff was gone, but I could still see him sometimes in my peripheral vision, watching from behind that strange street lamp. I drove home and wrote everything down, every detail I could remember about East Willow Road and my conversation with the other sheriff. But even as I wrote, I could feel the words becoming less solid, less real. The ink seemed to fade before it dried, and my memories of the encounter grew fuzzy around the edges. It's happening now, as I sit here in my office, trying to tell you this story. The details are slipping away, piece by piece, like water through a sieve. Soon, I won't remember East Willow Road at all. I won't remember the vanished streets, or the people who lived on them. I'll become just another small-town sheriff with 37 years of unremarkable service. But someone will notice. Someone always notices when a street disappears overnight, when a house stands empty where a family lived the day before. Someone will start asking questions, start keeping track, start documenting the impossible. And maybe, if they're very careful and very lucky, they'll drive down East Willow Road on a quiet night and meet an old sheriff standing under a street lamp that burns with all the wrong colors. Maybe they'll remember what I'm already starting to forget. Maybe they'll keep the story alive. Because that's all we can do, really. Remember the forgotten, witness the impossible, and hope that somewhere, in the spaces between what is and what was, the truth survives. Even when everything else disappears. I drove down East Willow Road last night. Problem is, it doesn't exist this morning. But I remember it existed. And for now, that has to be enough. Somewhere in those walls was a name I prayed I wouldn't find, but I did. 43 years I wore the badge in Millhaven. 43 years of drunk and disorderlies, domestic disputes, and the occasional break-in at Henderson's hardware store. Nothing that would make the county paper, let alone stick in a man's memory past Tuesday. But some cases, they don't let go. They burrow deep, like splinters under the skin, working their way towards something vital. The call came on a Tuesday morning in October, 1987. The leaves had turned early that year, and they hung on the branches like dying hands, refusing to fall. Mrs. Carmichael from the Historical Society was on the line, her voice thin as communion wafer. "Sheriff, you need to come down to the town hall. The renovation crew found something." The old town hall had been built in 1892, a squat brick building that had housed everything from court sessions to church suppers over the decades. The town council finally scraped together enough money to restore it, turn it into something respectable for the bicentennial celebration. Should have left it alone. I found the crew standing outside, 3 men in work clothes sharing cigarettes with hands that trembled just enough to notice. The foreman, a thick-set man named Kowalski, met me at the door. "It's in the basement," he said. "Behind the furnace room. We were opening up the walls to run new electrical and—" He stopped, took a long drag. "Well, you'd better see for yourself." The basement smelled like old coal and something else, something sweet and wrong, like flowers left too long in standing water. Our footsteps echoed off the brick walls as Kowalski led me through a maze of storage rooms and forgotten corners. The building seemed to press down on us, decades of weight and shadow. The furnace room was cramped, barely wide enough for the old cast-iron boiler that hadn't been fired up in 20 years. Kowalski pointed to the far wall, where they knocked away the plaster to expose the bare brick beneath. At first, I didn't see it. Just dark scratches in the mortar between the bricks, the kind of marks you'd expect in any old building. But as my eyes adjusted to the dim light from Kowalski's work lamp, the scratches resolved into something else entirely. Names. Dozens of them, carved deep into the mortar with something sharp. Not painted or chalked, carved, with the desperate pressure of someone who knew these might be their last words. "Jesus," I whispered. "That's what we said." Kowalski's voice was tight. "But look closer, Sheriff. Look at the names." I pulled out my flashlight, played the beam across the wall. The names were layered, some carved over others, creating a palimpsest of desperation. Sarah McKenna, 1923. Thomas Brewster, 1931. Mary Catherine Odell, 1945. The dates went back to the 1890s and forward to the 1970s. My blood went cold. These weren't random names. They were familiar. Too familiar. "Kowalski, get me a pad and paper." I spent the next 2 hours copying down every name I could make out, squinting in the yellow light, my hand cramping from the effort. 87 names in total, each with a date carved beside it. When I finished, I had Mrs. Carmichael drive me back to the station. The filing cabinets in my office held 40 years of missing persons reports, most of them yellowed and forgotten. People left small towns all the time, chasing work, running from debts, fleeing bad marriages. Most cases went cold after a few months of half-hearted investigation. I started with the most recent name, Patricia Vance, 1974. Found her file in the third drawer. 22 years old, worked at the diner on Main Street. Last seen walking home from her shift on a clear spring evening. No signs of struggle, no witnesses, no leads. Case closed after 6 months. Next, Robert Henley, 1968. 35, mechanic at Dawson's Garage. Left work one Tuesday afternoon, never made it home. His truck was found 3 days later by the interstate, keys still in the ignition. One by one, I matched the names on the wall to files in my cabinets. Every single one corresponded to a missing person from Millhaven. Cases spanning nearly a century, all presumed runaways or victims of foul play that was never proven. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what I found when I checked the dates more carefully. Each name was carved into the wall before the person was reported missing. Sometimes days before. Sometimes weeks. Sarah McKenna, carved in 1923, wasn't reported missing until October 15th of that year. Thomas Brewster's name bore the date March 3, 1931. He disappeared March 20th. The pattern held for every name I checked. Whatever force had compelled these people to carve their names into that basement wall, it had done so with the foreknowledge of what was to come. I leaned back in my chair, feeling suddenly old. Outside my window, the October sun was setting early, painting the sky the color of dried blood. Millhaven looked peaceful in the dying light. Neat rows of houses, tree-lined streets, church spires pointing toward heaven like accusing fingers. But appearances could lie. God knows this town had been lying to itself for over a century. I called Deputy Martinez in and showed him the list. He went pale as he read, recognizing names from old files, from stories passed down through families, from headstones in Riverside Cemetery that marked empty graves. "What do you want to do, Sheriff?" What could I do? Arrest a basement wall? Charge a building with conspiracy to commit murder? I told Martinez to seal off the town hall, post a guard, and keep quiet about what we'd found. Then I went home to my empty house and tried to make sense of the impossible. Sleep didn't come easy that night. I lay in bed listening to the house settle around me, every creak and groan amplified by the darkness. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, I gave up and went to sit on the front porch with a cup of coffee and my thoughts. Millhaven at night was a different place. During the day, it put on a mask of normalcy: kids riding bikes, mothers pushing strollers, old men playing checkers in the park. But in the dark hours, the mask slipped. The shadows between the street lights seemed deeper somehow, more secretive. The wind carried sounds that might have been voices, if you listened too closely. I'd lived here all my life, born in the house where my mother died, raised on stories of the town's founding fathers and their noble dreams. But sitting there in the dark, I began to wonder what other stories Millhaven might be hiding. What other secrets lay buried beneath its respectable facade. The next morning brought Mrs. Carmichael to my office, clutching her purse like a life preserver. "Sheriff, I've been thinking about what you found. About those names." She sat across from my desk, her back straight, her silver hair pulled into a bun that had probably looked the same for 30 years. Mrs. Carmichael had run the Historical Society since before I was born, keeper of the town's official memories. "There are stories," she said carefully. "Old stories. Things my grandmother used to tell me about the early days, about the building of the town hall." I leaned forward. "What kind of stories?" "They say the contractor who built it, man named Ezra Blackwood, he wasn't right in the head. Claimed he could see things others couldn't. The future, he said. People's fates written in their faces like newspaper headlines." Mrs. Carmichael's hands worried at her purse strap. "The town council wanted to fire him, but he was the lowest bidder, and times were hard. So they let him finish the job, despite the stories about him muttering to the walls, talking to empty rooms like there were people in them. What happened to Blackwood? Nobody knows for certain. One day he just stopped showing up to work. They found his tools in the basement, arranged neat as you please, but Ezra himself was gone. Some say he left town. Others say he never left at all." She leaned across the desk, her voice dropping to a whisper. "My grandmother used to say that Blackwood put something in those walls. Something that watched and waited and knew things it shouldn't know." I walked Mrs. Carmichael to the door, promising to look into her story. But as I watched her navigate the courthouse steps with careful, measured steps, I couldn't shake the feeling that she told me exactly what I needed to hear, and exactly what she wanted me to believe. The rest of the week passed in a haze of research and growing unease. I drove to the county seat, spent hours in their records office pulling up everything I could find about Ezra Blackwood and the construction of the town hall. The man existed. I found his contractor's license, tax records, even a faded photograph in the newspaper announcing the groundbreaking ceremony. But the deeper I dug, the stranger the picture became. Blackwood had bid on dozens of municipal projects across 3 counties between 1890 and 1892. Libraries, courthouses, schools, always the lowest bidder, always finishing on time and under budget. And in every single town where he'd worked, people had started disappearing. Not immediately. Sometimes years later. But the pattern was there, buried in old newspapers and forgotten police reports. Respectable citizens vanishing without a trace, leaving behind empty houses and unanswered questions. By Friday, I'd found records of similar buildings in 7 other towns. All built by Blackwood. All with basements that, according to renovation reports I dug up from various contractors over the decades, contained unusual markings in the walls. I should have left it alone. Should have filed my report, recommended the basement be sealed, and gone back to my routine of minor crimes and small-town problems. But curiosity has always been my weakness, and the names on that wall were calling to me like voices in the dark. Saturday morning found me back at the town hall with a crowbar and a flashlight, despite the yellow tape and the deputy I'd assigned to guard duty. Martinez had called in sick, convenient. but I didn't blame him. Some things were better left to fools and old men with nothing left to lose. The basement was colder than I remembered, and my breath came out in small puffs as I made my way to the furnace room. The names on the wall seemed to shimmer in the beam of my flashlight, as if they were moving, rearranging themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them. I set up my work light and examined the wall more carefully. The mortar between the bricks was old, but not uniform. In some places, it looked like it had been patched and repatched over the decades. And beneath the names, carved even deeper into the brick itself, were symbols I hadn't noticed before. They weren't English letters or numbers. They looked older, more primitive, like something you might find carved on a cave wall or scratched into a standing stone. But despite their age and strangeness, they seemed to pulse with meaning just beyond my comprehension. I was so focused on the symbols that I almost missed the sound. Scratching. Faint but persistent, coming from somewhere inside the wall itself. I pressed my ear to the brick, holding my breath. The sound was definitely there. Metal on stone, the same rhythm you'd expect from someone carving letters into mortar. Impossible. The wall was solid brick, with no cavities large enough to hold a person. But the sound continued, growing stronger as I listened. Scratch. 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 A pattern emerged. 3 quick scratches, then a pause. 3 more, then a longer pause. Then a series of scratches that seemed to spell out letters in some kind of code. I grabbed my crowbar and started working at the mortar around one of the loose bricks. It crumbled easily, too easily, as if it had been mixed with something other than proper cement. The brick came loose in my hands, and behind it was darkness that seemed to swallow my flashlight beam. The scratching stopped. I knelt down and peered into the hole I'd made. The space behind the wall was larger than it should have been, not just a gap between walls, but an actual room. My light beam picked out rough stone walls, a dirt floor, and something else that made my blood freeze. Bones. Human bones scattered across the floor like discarded toys. Rib cages and femurs and skulls that grinned up at me with empty sockets. Dozens of skeletons, maybe more, piled in the corners and spread across what looked like an underground chamber. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the fresh one. In the center of the chamber, still wearing the remnants of a blue dress and a tarnished locket, was a skeleton that couldn't have been there more than a few months. The bones were clean but not weathered, and scraps of fabric still clung to the ribs. I knew that dress. I knew that locket. Patricia Vance. Missing since 1974, name carved in the wall 13 years before she disappeared. I stumbled backward, my hands shaking as I played the light across the chamber. How was this possible? How could someone be killed and buried 13 years before they went missing? The scratching sound started again, louder now, coming from deeper in the chamber. I forced myself to look through the hole again, following the sound with my light. In the far corner, barely visible in the darkness, something moved. Not a skeleton. Not quite a person either, but something in between. It hunched over the wall, scratching frantically at the stone with fingernails worn down to bloody stumps. Even in the poor light, I could see that it was transparent around the edges, more shadow than substance. But I recognized the face. It was me, 20 years younger, wearing the uniform I'd worn in the late 60s, scratching my own name into the stone wall. The scratching stopped. The thing that looked like my younger self turned toward the hole in the wall, and I saw my own eyes staring back at me, eyes filled with knowledge of something terrible, something inevitable. It mouthed a single word. Soon. I scrambled away from the wall, knocking over my work light, plunging the basement into darkness. In the sudden black, I heard the scratching resume, faster now, more urgent. And underneath it, another sound, voices, dozens of them, whispering in unison. My name. Over and over, they whispered my name. I ran. 43 years of wearing a badge, and I ran like a schoolboy scared of shadows. Up the basement stairs, through the ground floor, out into the October morning that seemed too bright, too normal after what I'd seen. I sealed the hole with fresh mortar that same day, working by myself in the dim basement light. But I could still hear the scratching from inside the chamber, and I knew that fresh mortar wouldn't hold back whatever was waiting in there. That was 37 years ago. I retired the next year, moved to Florida, tried to forget what I'd seen in that basement room. But you can't run from some things. They follow you, patient as shadows, waiting for their time to come. I'm 81 now, and my hands shake when I write. The doctors say it's Parkinson's, but I know better. It's the waiting that makes them shake, the knowledge of what's coming. Because I've been keeping track. Every October for the past 37 years, I've checked the obituaries from Millhaven. And every October, without fail, someone else disappears. Someone whose name was carved in that wall decades before they were born. The pattern is accelerating. 2 disappearances this year, 3 the year before. And in my dreams I can still hear the scratching, still see that thing with my face working away at the stone wall, adding name after name to its collection. I tried to warn people. Called the sheriff's department in Millhaven, sent letters to the newspaper, even tried to contact some federal agencies. But who listens to a crazy old man rambling about impossible rooms and time-traveling murderers? Besides, I think the town likes its secrets. Millhaven has always been good at forgetting what it doesn't want to remember. But I remember. God help me, I remember everything. And now, sitting here in my Florida apartment with the evening news droning in the background, I can feel it starting again. The shaking in my hands is getting worse, and sometimes I catch myself scratching at the table without realizing it, carving patterns that look familiar, that pulse with meaning just beyond my understanding. Last night, I dreamed about the basement room again. But this time, I wasn't looking through a hole in the wall. I was inside the chamber, crouched in the corner with the bones and the shadows, scratching my name into the stone with fingernails worn down to nothing. And I knew, with the certainty that comes only in dreams, that somewhere in Millhaven, in a basement room that exists outside of time and reason, my name is already waiting on the wall. Has been waiting there since 1987, carved by hands that look like mine but belong to something else entirely. The phone is ringing now. Has been ringing for the past hour, but I haven't answered it. I know what voice I'll hear on the other end, what words it will speak. It's time to come home, it will say. Time to finish what was started. And the terrible thing is, part of me wants to go. Part of me is tired of running, tired of waiting, tired of carrying this secret like a stone in my chest. Part of me wants to walk back into that basement room and join the others, add my bones to the collection and my voice to the whispering choir. But I won't. Not yet. I'll keep writing, keep recording what I saw, keep trying to warn someone, anyone, about what's waiting in the walls of that old building. Because somewhere in those walls is a name I prayed I wouldn't find. And now I know it's mine. The scratching has started again. Not from Florida, not from memory, but from the walls of this apartment. Faint but growing stronger, metal on plaster, spelling out letters I don't want to read. My time is up. The room is calling, and I've put off the appointment too long. If you're reading this, if these words somehow make it out into the world, then maybe you can succeed where I failed. Maybe you can convince them to tear down that building, salt the earth where it stood, scatter the bones and break the pattern. Or maybe you'll become part of it, like I did. Like we all did in the end. The choice, if there ever really was one, is yours. But remember this, in Millhaven, some debts are paid in flesh, and some names are carved deeper than stone. The scratching is very loud now. Almost time to go. See you in the walls? I've seen a lot of graves in my time. Never one where the man inside was still scratching at the lid. That was 37 years ago, back when I still thought I understood the difference between the living and the dead. Back when I believed a badge and 40 years of law enforcement had shown me all the darkness this world had to offer. I was wrong about that. Dead wrong, you might say, though I don't find much humor in that phrase anymore. It started on a Tuesday morning in late September. The kind of morning where the air tastes like copper pennies and dying leaves, where the sun hangs pale and distant like it's already given up on the day. I was sitting in my office, going through paperwork that seemed to multiply overnight like some kind of bureaucratic cancer, when Deputy Martinez came through the door with that particular look on his face. You know the one, the look that says the day just took a hard left turn into territory you don't want to explore. "Sheriff," he said, and his voice had that tight quality it got when he was trying to keep something locked down inside. "We got a call from old Henrik. Says he found something out in the Blackwood tract." Henrik Olsen had been living on the edge of those woods for longer than most folks had been breathing. Norwegian stock, built like a scarecrow but twice as weathered, with eyes the color of winter ice. The kind of man who spoke maybe 50 words a year and meant every one of them. If Henrik called something in, it was worth attention. "What kind of something?" I asked, though part of me already knew I didn't want the answer. "Grave," Martinez said. "Fresh dug, he says." "But Sheriff..." He paused, worrying at his lower lip with his teeth. "He says there's breathing coming from inside." The words hung in the air between us like smoke from a dying fire. I set down my pen, a simple gesture that felt like stepping off a cliff, and reached for my hat. The drive out to Henrik's place took us through the heart of town, past the Methodist church with its white steeple pointing accusingly at the sky, past Kowalski's general store where the hand-painted sign had been fading for as long as anyone could remember. The streets were empty except for Mrs. Pemberton's tabby cat, which sat in the middle of Main Street washing itself with the kind of deliberate indifference that only cats possess. It watched our patrol car pass with golden eyes that seemed to hold secrets. Our town has always been the kind of place where secrets grow like weeds in the cracks of sidewalks. 3,000 souls, if you counted generously, nestled in a valley that time seemed to have forgotten. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business, except for the business that really matters. That business stays buried, literally and figuratively, until something like this happens. Henrik's property squatted at the end of a gravel road that the county had given up maintaining sometime during the Carter administration. His house was a tired-looking thing, all weathered, clapboard and sagging porch, but the vegetable garden beside it was immaculate. Tomatoes heavy on the vine, squash that looked like they belonged in a county fair, and not a weed in sight. Henrik had always understood the difference between what deserved care and what deserved neglect. He was waiting for us by his truck, a coffee mug steaming in his hands despite the warmth of the morning. The steam rose straight up in the still air, then seemed to twist and dissipate too quickly, as if something were disturbing it. "Sheriff," he said by way of greeting. His accent had never faded, even after 60 years in America. "Is in the woods? Quarter mile, maybe less. You follow the old deer trail past the Lightning Oak." I knew the tree he meant. Lightning had split it down the middle sometime in the 50s, but instead of dying, it had grown around the wound, creating something that looked more like a monument to survival than a living thing. Local kids dared each other to touch it after dark, though most were too smart or too scared to try. "You see who dug it?" I asked. Henrik shook his head. "Was not there yesterday. Ground was. He searched for the word. Quiet. Today is not quiet. We followed him into the woods, our boots crunching on leaves that had fallen too early, as if the trees couldn't wait to shed their burden. The Blackwood tract had always felt different from other places, older somehow, like it remembered things the rest of the world had forgotten. The air was thick with the smell of decomposing leaves and something else, something sweet and cloying that caught in the back of your throat. The trees closed around us as we walked, oak and maple and elm that had stood since before the town was even a thought in some developer's mind. Their branches intertwined overhead, creating a canopy that filtered the sunlight into something green and strange. Birds should have been singing. September was prime time for migration, but the woods were silent except for our footsteps and the distant sound of Henrik's breathing. We found the grave exactly where Henrik had said we would, in a small clearing maybe 20 yards past the lightning oak. Someone had taken considerable care with it. The rectangle of disturbed earth was precise, the sides straight, the dirt mounded neatly at one end. Fresh pine boards formed a rough coffin shape underneath maybe 3 feet of soil. It looked like the kind of job a professional would do, if professionals worked in the middle of nowhere with stolen bodies. But Henrik was right about the breathing. It was subtle at first, just a gentle rise and fall of the dirt, like the earth itself was taking slow, deliberate breaths. But as we stood there watching, it became more pronounced. The mound would lift maybe an inch, hold for a moment, then settle back down. Regular as clockwork. Regular as lungs filling and emptying. Jesus, Martinez whispered, crossing himself. His grandmother had been a devout Catholic, and some habits run deeper than conscious thought. I knelt beside the grave, pressing my ear to the dirt. Through the soil and wood, I could hear it clearly now, the soft, rhythmic sound of someone breathing. Not the desperate gasping you might expect from someone buried alive, but calm, peaceful breathing. The kind of breathing you hear from someone deep in sleep. Henrik, I said, standing and brushing dirt from my knees. How long you been hearing this? Since dawn, he replied. Maybe before. I do not sleep so good anymore. That made 3 of us, though for different reasons. Henrik had insomnia that came with age and too many memories. Martinez had night shift jitters. And me? I had the kind of sleep that came fitfully, full of dreams about things I'd seen and things I wished I hadn't. We need shovels, I said. And the coroner. And probably Father Mackenzie. Martinez looked at me sideways. Father Mackenzie? Call it a hunch, I said, though it was more than that. In 37 years of law enforcement, you develop instincts about when a situation is going to require more than standard police procedures. This was one of those times. While Martinez went back to the car to make the calls, I stayed with Henrik and the breathing grave. The old Norwegian hadn't moved from his spot 10 feet away, but I noticed he kept glancing at the tree line, as if he expected something to emerge from the deeper woods. Henrik, I said, you ever see anything like this before? He was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, my grandfather, he told stories. From the old country. About people who... He searched for words. Who were not ready to go. Not ready to go where? Wherever the dead go, he said simply. Sometimes, he said, they find ways to stay. Ways to keep breathing even when breathing should be finished. The breathing continued, steady and undisturbed, as if whoever was down there was having the most peaceful sleep of their life. Or death. Martinez returned with Dr. Vaughn, our county coroner, and 2 deputies with shovels. Father Mackenzie arrived 20 minutes later, a thin man with prematurely gray hair, and the kind of eyes that had seen too much suffering to believe in easy answers. He took one look at the breathing mound and began fingering the rosary in his pocket. Gentlemen, Dr. Vaughn said, setting down his medical bag. "I've been doing this job for 15 years. I've seen overdoses and accidents and suicides and murders. I've never seen a grave that breathes. First time for everything," I said, which was something my father used to say when life threw him a curveball. It hadn't prepared him for the heart attack that killed him at 52, and it wasn't preparing me for whatever we were about to uncover. The digging took the better part of an hour. The dirt was loose, recently turned, but there was a lot of it. As we got deeper, the breathing sound became more pronounced, accompanied now by the occasional scraping noise, soft, deliberate scratching that came in rhythm with the breathing. "Sheriff," one of the deputies said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "You hear that scratching?" I heard it. We all heard it. It sounded like fingernails against wood, patient and persistent. Not frantic, like you'd expect from someone trying to claw their way out. More like someone just occupying time. When we finally hit the pine boards, the breathing stopped. Just like that, as if whoever was inside had suddenly become aware of our presence. The silence that followed was worse than the breathing had been. It was the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums and makes you aware of your own heartbeat. "Well," Dr. Vaughn said, staring down at the wooden planks. "Someone want to tell me what we're looking at here?" I took a deep breath and nodded to the deputies. "Open it." The first board came up easily. Whoever had built this coffin hadn't used nails, just fitted the pieces together. The second board revealed pale fabric, what looked like a white shirt or burial shroud. The third board showed us a face. It was a man, maybe 60 years old, with gray hair and skin the color of old parchment. His eyes were closed, his hands folded peacefully across his chest. He looked for all the world like he was sleeping, except for two things. His skin had the waxy pallor of someone who'd been dead for days, and his chest was rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. "Mother of God," Father Mackenzie whispered. Dr. Vaughn knelt beside the makeshift coffin, professional instincts overriding the impossibility of what he was seeing. He pressed his fingers to the man's throat, checking for a pulse. His expression went through several changes: confusion, disbelief, something that might have been fear. "There's no pulse," he said quietly. "No pulse, but he's breathing. And his skin—" He touched the man's forehead. "Cold. Room temperature, maybe less." "Is he alive?" Martinez asked. "Define alive," Dr. Vaughn replied, which wasn't the kind of answer any of us wanted to hear. I stared down at the breathing corpse, trying to process what I was seeing. In all my years of law enforcement, I'd developed a practical approach to impossible things. Look for the logical explanation first, then work your way down to the illogical ones. But this situation seemed to have skipped the logical entirely and landed somewhere in territory I didn't have a map for. "Anyone recognize him?" I asked. The deputies shook their heads. Martinez frowned, studying the man's face. "Maybe there's something familiar, but I can't place it." Henrik stepped closer to the grave, his weathered face creased with concentration. "Thomas Henley," he said after a moment. The name hit me like cold water. Thomas Henley had been the town pharmacist for 30 years, a quiet man who'd lived alone above his shop on Elm Street. He died 6 days ago of a heart attack. I'd been at the funeral. I'd watched them lower his coffin into the ground at Riverside Cemetery, 3 miles from where we were standing. "Henrik," I said slowly, "Thomas Henley is buried in Riverside. I was there. We all were there." "No," Henrik said, shaking his head. "This is Thomas Henley. I buy medicines from him for 27 years. I know his face." I looked down at the breathing corpse again, and this time I saw it too, the narrow nose, the slight cleft in the chin, the way his hair fell across his forehead. It was Thomas Henley, no question about it. But Thomas Henley was dead and buried 3 miles away. "Father," I said, "you were at the funeral too. That Thomas Henley in the ground?" Father Mackenzie nodded, his face pale. "I performed the service myself. I watched them close the coffin. I threw dirt on the grave." "Then who?" Dr. Vaughn asked. "Is this?" The breathing corpse offered no answers. It just lay there, chest rising and falling, hands folded peacefully, eyes closed as if in the deepest sleep. Occasionally, we could hear the soft scratching sound from inside the coffin, fingernails against wood, patient and methodical. "We need to check Riverside," I said. "See if Thomas is still where we put him." It took 3 phone calls and an hour of waiting, but the answer came back clear. Thomas Henley's grave at Riverside Cemetery had been disturbed. The coffin was empty except for burial clothes and the lingering smell of formaldehyde. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of grave robbing. The body had simply left. While we waited for that confirmation, the breathing corpse had started moving. Nothing dramatic, just small adjustments, the way a sleeping person might shift to find a more comfortable position. A slight turn of the head, a repositioning of the hands. But each movement was deliberate and purposeful, as if the thing in the coffin was aware of our presence and was making itself comfortable for what might be a long conversation. "Sheriff," Martinez said, his voice tight with something that might have been panic, "what exactly are we dealing with here?" I wished I had an answer for him. In 37 years of law enforcement, I'd seen murders and suicides, accidents and overdoses, domestic violence and bar fights. I'd seen the worst that human beings could do to each other and themselves. But I'd never seen a dead man breathe. "Father," I said, "in your professional opinion, what are we looking at?" Father Mackenzie had been studying the breathing corpse with the intensity of a man trying to reconcile his faith with an impossible reality. "In seminary," he said slowly, "we studied various phenomena. Cases where the boundaries between life and death become unclear." "You mean like zombies?" Martinez asked. "Not zombies," Father Mackenzie said quickly. "Those are something else entirely. This is more like..." He paused, searching for words. "Like someone who refuses to accept that their time is finished. Someone who clings to the physical world even after their body has died." "Why would Thomas Henley refuse to die?" I asked. "I don't know," Father Mackenzie admitted. "He was a quiet man. Lived alone, kept to himself. Never missed Sunday service, but never stayed to socialize afterward. He seemed content with his life. Not the type to rage against mortality." The scratching sound from inside the coffin was getting louder, more insistent. It had developed a rhythm, like someone tapping out Morse code. But if it was a message, none of us knew how to read it. Dr. Vaughn had been taking notes throughout the conversation, documenting everything with the methodical precision of a man who understood that someday someone was going to ask him to explain what he'd seen. "Sheriff," he said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Shoot. Have there been any other unusual deaths recently? Anyone else who might have had reason to?" He gestured at the breathing corpse. "To stick around after they were supposed to go?" I thought about it. In a town of 3,000 people, death was a regular visitor but rarely a surprising one. Heart attacks, cancer, accidents, the occasional suicide. Nothing that seemed connected to what we were seeing now. "No," I said. "Nothing unusual. Thomas was the only recent death, and his was about as straightforward as they come. Heart attack in his sleep, found by Mrs. Patterson when he didn't open the pharmacy the next morning. What about before he died? Dr. Vaughn pressed. Any changes in behavior? Any indication that he was troubled by something? I was about to say no when Henrik spoke up. He was asking questions, the old Norwegian said. About the woods. About the old stories. We all turned to look at him. What kind of questions? I asked. He came to my house maybe 2 weeks before he died. Asked about my grandfather's stories. About the old country, about people who... Henrik glanced at the breathing corpse. People who find ways to stay. Why would he be interested in that? Henrik shrugged. He said he was doing research. For a book, maybe. But he seemed... Henrik searched for the word. Frightened. Like the stories were not just stories to him. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to form a picture, but it was a picture drawn in shadows and impossibilities. Thomas Henley, a quiet pharmacist with no apparent connection to the supernatural, had spent his last weeks researching ways to cheat death. Now he was lying in an unmarked grave in the middle of the woods, dead but breathing, his original burial site mysteriously empty. Sheriff, Father Mackenzie said quietly, I think we need to consider the possibility that Thomas Henley knew he was going to die. How could he know that? I don't know. But if he did know, and if he found some way to prepare for it, to ensure that death wouldn't be final. Father Mackenzie stared down at the breathing corpse. Then what we're seeing might be the result of that preparation. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows through the trees. The temperature was dropping, and I could see my breath when I exhaled. But the breathing corpse showed no signs of being affected by the cold. Its chest continued to rise and fall with mechanical regularity, and the scratching sounds had evolved into something that almost sounded like tapping. We can't leave him here, I said. Whatever Thomas has become, we can't just cover him back up and pretend this never happened. What do you suggest? Dr. Vaughn asked. I looked around at the assembled group. 2 deputies, a coroner, a priest, and an old Norwegian who collected supernatural stories like other people collected stamps. Not exactly the kind of team you'd want for a normal law enforcement situation, but then again, nothing about this situation was normal. We take him back to town, I said. Put him somewhere secure while we figure out what we're dealing with. The morgue? Dr. Vaughn suggested. The morgue doesn't have bars on the windows, I replied. If Thomas decides he wants to get up and walk around, I'd rather he be somewhere we can contain him. We ended up improvising a stretcher from pine boards and carrying the breathing corpse back to the cars. It was heavier than it should have been, not the weight of muscle and bone, but something denser, as if death had added substance rather than taking it away. Throughout the entire journey, Thomas never opened his eyes, never acknowledged our presence in any way. He just breathed and occasionally scratched at the inside of whatever container we put him in. The town jail had 2 cells, both currently empty. We put Thomas in the one with the better lighting and positioned a chair where someone could keep watch. Dr. Vaughn wanted to run tests. But what kind of tests do you run on someone who's clinically dead but functionally alive? Father Mackenzie wanted to perform some kind of blessing or exorcism, but Thomas didn't seem evil, just displaced. As night fell, I sent the deputies home and took the first watch myself. The jail was quiet except for the sound of Thomas breathing and the occasional scratch of his fingernails against the metal cot they'd placed him on. I sat in the chair outside his cell, drinking coffee that had gone cold hours ago, and tried to make sense of what I'd seen. At midnight, Thomas opened his eyes. They were the same brown eyes he'd had in life, but there was something different about them now, a depth that hadn't been there before, as if he were seeing things the rest of us couldn't. He turned his head slowly until he was looking directly at me, and then he smiled. "Sheriff," he said, and his voice was exactly as I remembered it, soft, polite, with just a trace of the accent he'd never quite lost from his childhood in Boston. "Thank you for bringing me inside. The woods can be so cold at night." I set down my coffee cup, trying to keep my hands steady. "Thomas," I said, "you're dead." "Yes," he agreed pleasantly. "I am. But I'm also here, talking to you. Death is more flexible than people realize." "How is that possible?" Thomas sat up on the cot, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that their body no longer followed all the usual rules. "I found some books," he said. "Old books, from before this town was properly civilized. Books about the spaces between life and death, about the ways a determined person might linger." "Why would you want to linger?" For the first time since opening his eyes, Thomas looked uncertain. "I had unfinished business," he said finally. "Things I needed to see completed." "What kind of things?" Thomas didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood up and walked to the bars of his cell, moving with the same quiet grace he'd had in life. "Sheriff," he said, "how well do you know the history of this town?" "Well enough. Founded in 1847, incorporated in 1852. Lumber town originally, then farming when the trees were gone. Population peaked around 1920, been declining slowly ever since." "That's the official history," Thomas said. "But there's another history. A darker one. Stories about why the lumber company left so suddenly. Stories about the things they found when they started cutting deep into the old forest." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature in the jail. "What kind of things?" "Bodies," Thomas said simply. "Old bodies buried in ways that didn't match any known burial practices. Bodies that were wrong somehow. Bodies that looked like they'd been trying to claw their way out of the ground long after they should have been nothing but bones." The scratching sound started again, Thomas's fingernails against the metal bars. But now I realized it wasn't random. It was a pattern, a rhythm that almost sounded like Morse code. "The lumber company tried to ignore it at first," Thomas continued. "But then the workers started disappearing. Not all at once, just one or two at a time. They'd go into the deep woods and never come back. And sometimes, weeks later, other workers would find graves that hadn't been there before. Fresh graves with something breathing inside." "Are you saying this has happened before?" "I'm saying this town was built on ground that doesn't like to let go of its dead," Thomas said. "And some of us have learned how to use that to our advantage." The pieces were starting to fit together, forming a picture that made a horrible kind of sense. The old stories Henrik's grandfather had told. The sudden departure of the lumber company. The way the town had always felt different, older, like it remembered things it shouldn't. "Thomas," I said, "what's your unfinished business?" He smiled again, but this time there was something predatory about it. "There are others," he said. "Others who've learned the same secrets I learned. Others who've found ways to stay after their time should be finished. But they haven't been as careful as I have." "What do you mean?" "Some of them have been feeding," Thomas said quietly. "Taking what they need from the living to sustain their existence between life and death. Small things at first, a little vitality here, a few years of life there. But they're getting bolder. And hungrier." The coffee I'd been drinking suddenly tasted like ashes in my mouth. "Who?" I asked. "Mrs. Pemberton," Thomas said. "She died 3 years ago, but she's still walking around, still tending that garden of hers. Haven't you noticed how nothing ever dies in her yard? How her vegetables grow so much larger than anyone else's?" I had noticed. Everyone had noticed. We'd all just assumed she had a green thumb. And old Henrik, Thomas continued. His grandfather didn't just tell stories about the spaces between life and death. His grandfather taught him how to navigate those spaces. Henrik has been dead for 7 years, Sheriff. He's just very good at pretending otherwise. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Henrik, who'd found the grave. Henrik, who'd known exactly where to look and exactly what we'd find. Henrik, who told stories about people who weren't ready to go. The whole town, I said, and my voice came out as barely a whisper. Not the whole town, Thomas said. Not yet. But more than you might think. Death isn't the ending people believe it to be, Sheriff. It's just a change of address. I stood up so quickly that the chair fell over backward. I need to make some calls. You can try, Thomas said. But who are you going to call? And how are you going to explain what you've learned? Who's going to believe that your quiet little town is full of dead people who've forgotten how to stay buried? He was right, and we both knew it. I could call the state police, the FBI, the National Guard if I wanted to. But what was I going to tell them? That I'd found a breathing corpse in the woods? That half the town might be dead but still walking around? They'd think I'd lost my mind. What do you want from me? I asked. Help, Thomas said simply. I've been fighting them for months, trying to find a way to put them back where they belong. But I'm just one person, and I'm not even properly alive anymore. I need someone who still has authority among the living. Why should I trust you? Because, Thomas said, I'm the only one who's told you the truth. And because if you don't help me, this town is going to become something much worse than it already is. I looked at the breathing corpse in the jail cell, Thomas Henley, who died 6 days ago and come back to warn me about the other dead who never left. The scratching sound had stopped, and the jail was quiet except for the sound of his breathing and the distant tick of the clock on the wall. Tell me what I need to do, I said. Thomas smiled, and for the first time since he'd opened his eyes, it looked genuinely grateful. First, he said, we need to visit some graves. Starting with my own. The next few hours were the longest of my life. Thomas explained how the dead had been hiding among the living, how they'd learned to mimic life so perfectly that even they sometimes forgot what they'd become. He told me about the hunger that drove them, the need to take vitality from the living to sustain their impossible existence. And he told me about the old burial ground deep in the woods, where the original settlers had tried to contain something they didn't understand and had only made it stronger. By dawn, we had a plan. It wasn't a good plan. Good plans don't usually involve digging up graves and confronting the walking dead. But it was the only plan we had. I let Thomas out of his cell, and together we walked through the empty streets of the town I'd protected for 37 years. The morning air was cold and still, and our footsteps echoed off the silent buildings. Everything looked normal. The white church steeple, the faded sign at Kowalski's store, the neat lawns and quiet houses where people were presumably sleeping peacefully. But now I knew better. Now I could see the subtle signs I'd been missing for years. The way Mrs. Pemberton's garden thrived even in drought conditions. The way Henrik never seemed to age, despite being older than anyone had a right to be. The way certain people in town never got sick, never seemed tired, never quite seemed to cast shadows the way living people should. We started at Riverside Cemetery, where Thomas's original grave stood empty. The coffin was there, lined with white satin and smelling of formaldehyde, but the body that should have been inside was walking beside me through the morning mist. How many others? I asked. I count at least a dozen, Thomas said. Maybe more. They're careful about revealing themselves. They've learned that the secret to a successful haunting is subtlety. We spent the day visiting graves, checking records, comparing dates of death with sightings of the supposedly deceased. By afternoon, I had a list of 17 names, people who died in the past 5 years but were still being seen around town. People who were taking just enough life force from their neighbors to sustain their impossible existence. As the sun began to set, Thomas and I stood at the edge of the old burial ground he told me about. It was deeper in the woods than I'd ever ventured, in a clearing that felt wrong somehow, too quiet, too still, as if the air itself were holding its breath. The graves here were old, marked with stones carved in symbols I didn't recognize. Some were caved in, as if something had clawed its way out from inside. Others were pristine, as if they'd been tended by someone who cared about appearances. "This is where it started," Thomas said. "This is where the first ones learned how to stay. How do we stop them?" Thomas looked at me with eyes that held the wisdom of the dead and the sorrow of someone who'd seen too much. "We don't stop them, Sheriff. We can't. Death has already been cheated here too many times. The boundary has been worn too thin. Then what's the point of all this?" "The point," Thomas said, "is that someone needs to know. Someone needs to understand what this town has become. And someone needs to decide what to do about it." As he spoke, figures began emerging from the woods around us. Mrs. Pemberton, still wearing her gardening apron. Henrik, carrying the same coffee mug I'd seen him with that morning. A dozen others, people I'd known for years, people I'd watched die and mourned and buried. They moved with the same careful grace Thomas had shown, the deliberate movement of people who no longer had to worry about the limitations of living flesh. Their eyes held the same depth, the same awareness of things beyond normal human perception. "Sheriff," Mrs. Pemberton said, her voice as sweet and grandmotherly as it had been in life. "Thomas told us you might be willing to help us." "Help you do what?" "Continue," she said simply. "We've built something here, something remarkable. A community where death doesn't have to be the end. Where people can stay with the ones they love, where knowledge and experience don't have to be lost to the grave." "You're taking life from the living," I said. "Just a little," Henrik said, his Norwegian accent as thick as ever. "Just enough to sustain ourselves. Most people never even notice. A few years off a life here and there. They live such wasteful lives anyway." I looked around at the circle of dead faces, people I'd known and trusted and served alongside for decades. They were still the same people, in most ways. Still recognizable, still carrying the personalities and memories they'd had in life. But there was something else there now, something hungry and patient and utterly inhuman. "What do you want from me?" I asked. "Protection," Thomas said. "Legitimacy. Your authority as sheriff to help us maintain the fiction that we're still among the living. And if I refuse?" Mrs. Pemberton smiled, and her teeth seemed sharper than they should have been. "Then you become one of us anyway, Sheriff. Just less willingly." I felt the circle closing around me, felt the weight of their attention like a physical presence pressing against my skin. These weren't monsters in the traditional sense. They were my neighbors, my friends, people I'd known for years. But they were also something else now, something that existed in the spaces between life and death. "How long do I have to decide?" I asked. "You've already decided," Thomas said sadly. "You decided the moment you chose to help me instead of calling for backup. You decided when you let me out of that cell. You decided when you followed me here." He was right, and I knew it. I'd made my choice without realizing it, drawn into their world by curiosity and compassion and the simple human desire to understand impossible things. The transformation didn't hurt as much as I'd expected. It felt more like falling asleep, a gradual dimming of the world around me, a slow cooling of my blood, a gentle settling into something deeper and more permanent than ordinary sleep. My heart stopped beating sometime around midnight. But I didn't stop being conscious. I just became conscious of different things. That was 37 years ago, and I'm still the sheriff of this quiet little town. Still keeping the peace, still protecting the citizens, still maintaining order in my own particular way. The living residents don't know what we are. They don't need to know. They live their lives, raise their children, pursue their dreams, and contribute a little bit of their vitality to those of us who've learned how to make death optional. It's not a perfect system, but it works. The town thrives in its own quiet way. Crime is practically non-existent. It's hard to commit serious crimes in a place where many of the authority figures have literally transcended human limitations. The living residents tend to be remarkably long-lived and healthy, as if the presence of so many who've cheated death has some kind of protective effect on the community as a whole. And every few years, someone else joins our little community of the persistent dead. Usually someone who's curious, someone who asks too many questions, someone who can't quite let mysteries stay buried. They come looking for answers, and they find more than they bargained for. Like you, for instance. You came here asking about strange stories, about unexplained phenomena, about the kinds of cases that don't make it into official reports. You wanted to know about the paranormal files that law enforcement agencies don't like to discuss. Well, now you know. The question is, what are you going to do with that knowledge? You can leave, of course. Walk away from this town and never come back. Forget what I've told you. Dismiss it as the ramblings of an old man with too much imagination and too much time on his hands. Go back to your normal life in your normal world where death is final and the dead stay buried. Or you can stay. You can become part of something larger than yourself, something that transcends the usual limitations of human existence. You can help us maintain the balance between the living and the dead. Help us protect this community we've built in the spaces where life and death overlap. The choice is yours, but I should mention, you've been here for 3 days now, listening to my story. 3 days without eating, without sleeping, without really noticing the passage of time. That's not normal for someone who's still entirely among the living. Look at your hands. Really look at them. Notice how pale they've become. How still your pulse feels under your skin. Notice how the air tastes different now, how the shadows seem deeper and more welcoming than they used to. You're changing already, just from exposure to our world. It's a gradual process, usually takes about a week to complete. But once it starts, there's no going back. Your body is already learning how to exist without some of the things it used to need. Your consciousness is already expanding to accommodate awareness of things that living people can't perceive. I can see the fear in your eyes, but there's curiosity there too. Wonder. The same expression Thomas had when he first realized what was happening to him. The same expression I had when I understood that death wasn't the ending I'd always believed it to be. We're not monsters, despite what you might think. We're just people who've learned how to continue being people even after our bodies have forgotten how to live. We still care about the same things we cared about when we were alive. Our community, our relationships, our purpose. We still laugh and worry and hope and dream. We just do it all from a different kind of existence. And we still protect and serve. That hasn't changed for me. I still get up every morning and put on this badge and work to keep this town safe. I still investigate crimes and settle disputes and help people in trouble. The only difference is that now I have a more complete understanding of what trouble can include. The sun is setting again. Time moves differently when you're transitioning between life and death. Hours can feel like minutes, or minutes can stretch into eternities. But the transformation is almost complete now. I can see it in the way you're breathing, the way your skin has taken on that particular translucent quality that marks someone who's successfully navigating the spaces between states of being. Welcome to the community, friend. Welcome to the Sheriff's Paranormal Files, not the stories we tell, but the reality we live. There's a house on Maple Street that just came available. Nice place, good garden in the back. Mrs. Pemberton says the roses there are particularly responsive to the right kind of care. The kind of care that someone like you, someone like us, can provide. We'll need to update the town records, of course. Add your name to the list of permanent residents. File the paperwork that makes your continued existence here official and unremarkable. It's amazing how much bureaucracy you can avoid when you don't have to worry about things like social security numbers and tax records for people who are officially deceased. The living residents will accept you easily enough. They always do. People in small towns are remarkably adaptable, especially when that adaptation happens gradually. You'll become part of the landscape, another familiar face in a community where everyone knows everyone else's business. Or thinks they do. And eventually someone else will come asking questions. Someone else will be curious about the strange stories and unexplained phenomena. Someone else will want to know about the paranormal files that don't make it into official reports. When that happens, you'll understand what I understand now. You'll know why we do what we do, why we maintain this careful balance between the living and the dead. You'll know why some stories can only be told by those who've lived them, or died them, as the case may be. Until then, welcome home. The breathing never stops, you know. Even when you don't need it anymore, even when your lungs have forgotten their original purpose, the breathing continues. It's comforting in a way. A reminder that existence doesn't end just because life does. A promise that there are always more stories to tell, more mysteries to solve, more cases for the sheriff's paranormal files. I've seen a lot of graves in my time. Never one where the man inside was still scratching at the lid. But now I know, we're all scratching at something. The living scratch at the surface of understanding, trying to comprehend mysteries that can only be fully known from the other side. And the dead scratch at the boundaries of existence, trying to maintain connections to the world they've left behind. The scratching never stops. It just changes rhythm, changes purpose, changes meaning. Listen carefully, and you'll hear it everywhere, in the whisper of wind through dying leaves, in the settling of old houses at night, in the quiet sounds that small towns make when they think no one is listening. That's the sound of secrets trying to stay buried, and the sound of truth slowly clawing its way to the surface. That's the sound of the sheriff's paranormal files. And now, it's your sound too. I recognized his face the second he stepped through my office door, but the problem is, he was declared dead before half my deputies were born. Tommy Brennan. 24 years old when he vanished into the Whitmore Woods in October of 1985. Same sandy hair, same freckles scattered across his nose like someone had flicked a paintbrush at him. Same worn Carhartt jacket with the tear on the left elbow. Same muddy red-winged boots that squeaked against my linoleum floor exactly the way they had 40 years ago when he'd come in to report a busted mailbox or complain about his neighbor's dog. The only thing different was his eyes. They held something I couldn't quite place, like looking into a well and seeing your own reflection wavering in water too deep to measure. "Sheriff Caldwell," he said, and his voice carried that same slight rasp from too many Marlboro Reds. "I need to report myself missing. I'd been sheriff of Millbrook County for 37 years. Seen 3 different decades try to modernize our little corner of northern Maine, watched the paper mill close and half the families move away, buried more friends than any man should have to. But I'd never had a dead man walk into my office and file a report. My hand found the coffee mug beside my desk blotter, a habit when my nerves started singing. The ceramic was cold. Steam had stopped rising from it sometime during the conversation I'd been having with Deputy Martinez about the Morrison boys' DUI, but I couldn't remember when. Time had gotten slippery, The way it does during ice storms when the power flickers and you lose track of whether it's morning or evening. Tommy, I said, keeping my voice level the way you do with spooked horses and unstable people. Where have you been? He sat down in the chair across from my desk without being asked. The springs creaked, not the normal protest of old furniture, but something deeper, like the sound trees make before they fall. Hunting, he said. Same place I always hunted. Same deer stand my father built in '68. The Brennan stand. I knew it well enough. Search parties had combed that section of woods for weeks after Tommy disappeared. State police brought in dogs. Volunteers from 3 counties beat through every thicket and hollow within 10 miles of his last known location. Found his truck parked at the old logging road, keys still in the ignition, rifle missing. Never found Tommy. Never found the rifle either. His mother Agnes had died 8 years after he vanished, still setting a place for him at Sunday dinner. His father Walt lasted until 92, spent his final decades walking those woods every evening until his hip gave out, calling Tommy's name into the darkening trees. Sometimes other folks reported hearing Walt's voice echoing back from deep in the forest, but it never sounded quite right. Too many syllables, or stretched too long, like an echo that had gotten lost and picked up extra sounds along the way. You've been hunting for 40 years? I asked. Tommy nodded. Good hunting this season. Plenty of deer. More than I remembered. Through my office window, I could see the Whitmore woods rising beyond the town limits like a dark wall. October had come early this year, painting the maples brilliant red, but something about the color seemed wrong, too bright, almost pulsing in the afternoon light. As a boy, I'd spent countless hours in those woods with my father and grandfather, learning to track and read sign. But there'd always been places even my grandfather wouldn't go, sections where the trees grew too close together, and the underbrush swallowed sound. Tommy, you disappeared in October of 1985. It's October 2025 now. He looked at me with those well-water eyes. I know what year it is, Sheriff. But time works different in the deep woods. Always has. My grandfather used to say the same thing. He'd grown up when Millbrook was still mostly wilderness, when the Penobscot people still came through on hunting parties and the old-timers still remembered stories their grandparents told about things that lived between the trees. Time gets stretchy back in there. He'd warned me. Go in at sunrise, come out at sunset, but your pocket watch says only 10 minutes past. Or the other way around, think you've been walking for an hour, come out to find it's been 3 days and your mother's got half the county looking for you. I dismissed it as old man's tales until I became sheriff and started keeping track of missing persons reports. Nothing dramatic, nothing that made the newspapers. But over the years, I'd noticed patterns. Hikers who got turned around and emerged from the woods swearing they'd only been lost for a few hours, despite search parties looking for them for days. Hunters who insisted they'd made camp in familiar territory, only to discover landmarks had shifted or disappeared entirely. Kids who wandered off during family picnics and returned with stories of meeting other children who spoke in outdated slang and wore clothes that belonged in old photographs. Most unsettling were the reports of people seeing themselves in the woods, their own faces peering out from between distant trees, their own voices calling from deeper in the forest. The sensible explanation was that isolation and stress could make anyone's mind play tricks. But there'd been too many reports over too many years from too many reliable witnesses. Tommy, I need to ask you some questions. Standard procedure. He nodded again, patient as stone. Where exactly have you been staying? I mean, sleeping, eating? Same camp I always used. About 3 miles past the old beaver pond, up where the ridge starts to climb toward Mount Caribou. Got a lean-to built into the rock face, stays dry even in heavy rain. I knew the area. Search parties had covered it thoroughly in '85. No lean-to, no sign of recent habitation. But then again, the woods had a way of hiding what they wanted to hide. What have you been eating? Venison mostly. Some fish from the streams. Wild berries when they're in season. Mushrooms if you know which ones are safe. He paused, tilting his head slightly. Though the berries taste different now. Sweeter. Almost too sweet. My skin prickled. Agnes Brennan used to make the finest wild berry pies in 3 counties. She taught Tommy which berries to pick and when, knowledge passed down through generations of Brennans who'd lived off the land. If anyone would know how wild berries were supposed to taste, it was Tommy. And your rifle? The one that went missing with you? For the first time since he'd walked in, Tommy's expression changed. Something flickered across his features, confusion, maybe, or fear. It's hard to remember. I had it when I went into the woods. Been carrying it every day since. But when I try to think about it directly, it gets fuzzy. Fuzzy how? Like looking at something through water. I know it's there, but the details won't stay put. I'd interviewed enough trauma victims to recognize dissociation, but this felt different. Tommy spoke with the calm certainty of someone describing their daily routine, not the halting confusion of someone trying to recover buried memories. It was as if his mind had simply edited out certain details the way you might crop an unwanted person out of a photograph. Tommy, I need to be straight with you. You were legally declared dead in 1993, 8 years after you disappeared. He absorbed this information without surprise. I figured as much. Mother and Dad? Both passed. Your mother in '93, your father in 2019. Tommy's hands, which had been resting calmly on his knees, clenched into fists, then relaxed. The only sign that this news affected him at all. Dad kept looking for me, didn't he? Every day until he couldn't walk anymore. I know. I saw him sometimes, walking the old trails. Wanted to call out to him, but... Tommy trailed off, staring at something beyond my shoulder. But the distance was too far. Not miles, something else. Like we were on opposite sides of thick glass. The afternoon light streaming through my office window had started to change, taking on that peculiar golden quality that comes just before sunset. But my wall clock showed it was only 2:30. I glanced outside and saw the sun hanging lower than it should have been, casting shadows that stretched too long and fell at impossible angles. Tommy, I need you to help me understand something. If you've been in the woods for 40 years, how did you survive winters? Maine winters can kill a man in a few hours if he's not prepared. Winters were the easiest part, he said. Found caves that stayed warm no matter how cold it got outside. And the snow, it looked like snow, felt like snow when you touched it, but it didn't make you cold. Almost like it was just the idea of snow instead of the real thing. My coffee mug slipped from my fingers and shattered against the floor. The sound seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have, echoing off the walls in diminishing waves. Tommy looked down at the broken ceramic, then back up at me with those water-deep eyes. Sheriff, I think I need to tell you why I came back. I'm listening. There's something wrong in the woods. Always has been, but it's getting stronger. Hungrier. He leaned forward, and I caught a scent that made my stomach turn. Not unpleasant exactly, but wrong. Like flowers blooming in December, or the smell of rain during a drought. It's been feeding on lost time, lost people. Fed on me for 40 years, but I wasn't enough anymore. It needs more. More what? More people. Fresh people. People with strong connections to the world outside the trees. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. It sent me back to bring others. The temperature in my office seemed to drop 10 degrees. I could see my breath beginning to mist, though the heating system had been running fine all day. More disturbing was the way the light continued to change, growing more golden and somehow thicker, as if the air itself was turning amber. "Tommy, who sent you back?" "Not who." "What?" He stood up slowly, his movements too fluid, too graceful for someone who'd supposedly been living rough in the wilderness for 4 decades. "It doesn't have a name, least not one that makes sense in English. But it's old, Sheriff. Been in those woods since before the Penobscot, since before people at all. It remembers when the glaciers came down from the north, remembers when this whole area was under an ocean that dried up millions of years ago." I reached for the service weapon holstered at my hip, but my hand moved through honey-thick air. Everything had slowed down except Tommy, who continued speaking in that calm, reasonable voice while the world around us turned strange. It showed me things while I was there. Showed me the town's history, all the people who've gone missing over the years. They're not gone, Sheriff. They're still there, living in pockets of time that got separated from the mainstream. Some of them have been there for over a century, still going about their daily business, never aging, never dying, never knowing they're trapped. Through my window, I could see Main Street, but it looked different now. The buildings were the same, but they seemed somehow more substantial, as if they'd gained extra dimensions I couldn't quite perceive. People walked along the sidewalks, but their movements were too regular, too rhythmic, like actors following carefully rehearsed blocking. It wants the whole town, Sheriff. Always has. But it needed someone who could move between its world and this one, someone who could guide others into the deep woods where time gets soft and malleable. Tommy smiled, and his teeth were too white, too straight, too many. Someone people would trust. Why me? Because you're the sheriff. People listen to you, follow you. And because you've got one foot in the old world already, your grandfather's stories, your family's connection to these woods going back 5 generations. You're already halfway there. The golden light outside my window was growing brighter, more intense. I could hear sounds from the street, but they were wrong. Horse hooves on pavement, the creak of wagon wheels, voices calling out and greeting but using names I didn't recognize. When I squinted through the impossible illumination, I caught glimpses of people in old-fashioned clothing walking alongside residents I knew, their paths intersecting without either group seeming to notice the other. "The thing in the woods?" I managed to say through air that felt like liquid. "What does it want with us?" "Company," Tommy said simply. "It's been alone for so long that loneliness has become its defining characteristic. It doesn't want to hurt anyone, it wants to preserve them, keep them safe in moments that never end. No death, no aging, no sorrow. Just an eternal present where nothing bad ever happens because nothing ever changes. That's not living, Tommy. That's just existing. Maybe. But it's better than dying." His form was starting to shimmer around the edges, like heat distortion rising from summer pavement. "And everyone dies eventually, Sheriff. This way, they get to stay themselves forever." I tried to stand, but my legs wouldn't obey. The chair beneath me felt like it was sinking into the floor, or maybe the floor was rising to meet me. Either way, I was becoming part of the office, part of the building, part of the town that was slowly being absorbed into whatever impossible space Tommy had emerged from. "Fight it," I told myself. "Fight whatever this is." But fighting meant acknowledging that something impossible was happening, and my rational mind kept trying to find logical explanations. Maybe I was having a stroke. Maybe I'd been drugged. Maybe the stress of the job had finally caught up with me and I was experiencing some kind of psychotic break. The problem with logical explanations was that they didn't account for what I could see outside my window, Main Street stretching backward and forward through time simultaneously, showing me the town as it had been in 1950, 1920, 1890, all the way back to when it was just a trading post beside a river. And in all those different eras, I could see the same woods rising beyond the buildings like a patient predator, waiting for the right moment to swallow everything. "Sheriff," Tommy said, his voice now coming from everywhere and nowhere. "You can make this easy or hard, but it's going to happen either way. The town's already halfway gone, has been for years. All those missing persons reports, all those people who got lost in the woods and never came back. They've been building a new Millbrook in the spaces between seconds, and it's almost complete. What about my deputies? My family? They'll come too, eventually. Time moves different there, remember? You could spend 100 years in the deep woods and still arrive back here 5 minutes before you left. You could watch over the town forever, keep everyone safe from harm." The golden light outside had become so bright I could barely see through it, but I caught one last glimpse of the street. Mrs. Henderson from the post office was walking hand in hand with a young man in a Union Army uniform. The Morrison boy who'd gotten the DUI was sitting on a bench beside an elderly woman in a Victorian dress, both of them laughing at some shared joke. Deputy Martinez was directing traffic that included Model T Fords alongside modern pickup trucks, and he seemed to find nothing unusual about any of it. My town. My people. All of them caught in the amber of eternal moments, preserved like insects in prehistoric tree sap. "I won't let you take them," I said, though my voice sounded hollow and distant to my own ears. "Sheriff," Tommy replied, and now his voice carried the weight of centuries. "I'm not taking them anywhere. I'm bringing them home." The last thing I remember clearly is the sensation of falling upward, of being pulled through layers of time like someone peeling away sheets of tissue paper. For just a moment, I could see everything, the town as it was, as it had been, as it would be, all existing simultaneously in a space that had no need for linear progression. And then I was standing in a forest that looked exactly like the Whitmore Woods, but felt like somewhere else entirely. The trees were the same species, maple, oak, pine, birch, but they grew in patterns that made geometric sense only if you weren't thinking too hard about geometry. The light filtering through the canopy was golden and perfect, never changing, never fading. Tommy stood beside me, looking exactly as he had in my office, exactly as he had 40 years ago when he'd first walked into these woods. "Welcome home, Sheriff," he said. I looked back the way we'd come, but there was no way back. Just more trees stretching into a distance that might have been miles or might have been moments. Somewhere behind us, I could hear the sounds of a town going about its daily business, car engines' voices, the bell at the elementary school marking the end of another day. But the sounds seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if the entire town had been scattered throughout the forest and was slowly gathering itself back together. "How long before they realize we're gone?" I asked. Tommy smiled that too wide smile. "Sheriff, we were never gone. We're exactly where we've always been. It's just that where means something different now." In the distance, I could see other figures moving between the trees. Some I recognized. People who'd gone missing over the years, people who'd been declared dead but had actually been declared alive in a place where death was just another concept that didn't quite apply. They waved when they saw us, called out greetings, invited us to join them for dinner or cards or just conversation. And I realized that Tommy was right about one thing: it wasn't unpleasant here. The temperature was comfortable, the light was warm, the air smelled of pine and possibility. No traffic noise, no crime, no budget meetings or personnel disputes or any of the 100 small irritations that made up daily life in the real world. Just peace, and company, and the promise that tomorrow would be exactly like today. The only problem, and it took me a while to notice this, time being what it was in that place, was that after a few hours or days or years, I started to forget what I was supposed to be worried about. The details of my old life grew fuzzy, not through any malicious intervention but simply through lack of use. When you don't need to remember deadlines or appointments or responsibilities, those memories just fade. I still knew I was Sheriff Caldwell. I still knew I'd lived in Millbrook my whole life. But the urgency of those facts diminished until they became just interesting biographical details rather than defining characteristics. Sometimes I thought I heard voices calling from somewhere outside the forest. Worried voices, searching voices, official voices conducting investigations and filing reports and trying to make sense of disappearances that couldn't be explained through conventional means. But those voices seemed to come from very far away, from a world that operated according to rules I was forgetting how to understand. The worst part, or maybe the best part, depending on your perspective, was that I was genuinely happy there. Not the frantic, temporary happiness of achieving a goal or receiving good news, but the deep, settled contentment of being exactly where you belong. It was the kind of happiness that made you forget you'd ever been unhappy, the kind that made you wonder why anyone would choose struggle and uncertainty over peace and permanence. Years passed, or maybe minutes. The distinction had become meaningless. I walked the endless trails with Tommy and the others, learned their stories, shared meals that satisfied without ever making us full, slept in shelters that appeared whenever we needed them and disappeared when we moved on. And gradually, I began to understand what the presence in the woods truly wanted. Not malice, not conquest, but connection. It had been alone for so long that loneliness had become its nature, and it saw in human beings something it envied, the ability to exist in communities, to share experiences, to find meaning in temporary joys and sorrows. It didn't want to hurt us. It wanted to become us, or rather, to make us part of itself so that it could finally understand what it meant to not be alone. The terrible truth was that it worked. In that place between moments, surrounded by people I'd known and people I'd never met but somehow remembered, I felt more connected to my community than I ever had in the real world. We were all part of something larger than ourselves, all threads in a tapestry that would never unravel because it existed outside the reach of time's erosive power. But sometimes, in the spaces between conversations, I would remember my grandfather's warnings about the deep woods. And I would remember that being happy and being right weren't always the same thing. The presence never spoke to me directly, but I could feel it sometimes, watching through the eyes of trees, listening through the rustle of leaves. It was patient beyond human comprehension, content to wait for each new arrival to adjust to their circumstances, to find their place in the eternal community it was building. And I realized that I was part of the process now. Just as Tommy had been sent back to guide me into the woods, eventually I would be sent back to guide others. Not because I wanted to, but because the logic of the place demanded it. The community needed to grow, needed new voices and new stories to keep the conversation interesting across the centuries. The day I finally returned to Millbrook, though day and returned are imprecise terms for what actually happened, I walked into the police station and found Deputy Martinez at my desk, wearing the sheriff's badge I'd worn for 37 years. He looked up when I entered, and his face went through the same sequence of expressions mine had when Tommy walked into my office all those years or minutes ago. Recognition. Confusion. Fear. "Sheriff Caldwell," he said. "You've been missing for 3 months. 3 months. It felt like no time at all, and also like forever. I need to report a missing person," I told him, sitting down in the chair where Tommy had sat, where I suspected others had sat before him and others would sit after me. "Who's missing, Sheriff?" I looked at him with eyes that had seen too much golden light, eyes that reflected depths no man should have to carry. "Everyone," I said. "They just don't know it yet." Outside the window, the Whitmore woods rose like a dark wall against the October sky, patient as stone, hungry as time itself. And somewhere deep in those trees, Tommy was waiting with all the others, building a community that would last forever because it existed in a place where forever was just another word for now. The only question was who would be next to discover how good it felt to never have to leave home again. I smiled at Deputy Martinez, my replacement, my successor, my eventual companion, and began to explain why he really needed to come with me to investigate some strange reports from the deep woods. After all, the town was almost complete. We just needed a few more residents to make it perfect. And time, as my grandfather always said, works different in the deep woods. Different, but always in favor of those patient enough to wait.